The plight of the individual in modern society. What will the future bring? From time immemorial this question has occupied men's minds, though not always to the same degree. Historically, it is chiefly in times of physical, political, economic, and spiritual distress that men's eyes turn with anxious HOLR to the future, and when anticipations, utopias, and visions multiply. One thinks, for instance, of the chiliastic expectations of the Augustan age at the beginning of the Christian era, or of the spiritual changes in the West which accompanied the end of the first millennium. Today, as the end of the second millennium draws near, we are again living in an age filled with apocalyptic images of universal destruction. What is the significance of that split, symbolized by the Iron Curtain, which divides humanity into two halves? What will come of our civilization, and of man himself, if the hydrogen begin to go off, or if the spiritual and moral darkness of state absolutism should spread over year 01R? We have no reason to take this threat lightly. Everywhere in the West there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the torches ready, with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. One should not overestimate the thickness of this stratum. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. Also, it is regionally dependent on public education and is subject to the influence of acutely disturbing factors of an economic nature. Taking plebiscites as a criterion, one could on an optimistic estimate put its upper limit at about 40% of the electorate. A rather more pessimistic view would not be unjustified either. Sir, the gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding, and even where it exists it proves tobe wavering and inconstant, the more so, as a tool, the bigger the groups are. The mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still arseable with the individual. And this necessarily leads to an authoritarian tyranny if ever the constitutional state should succumb to a fit of weak rational argument conducted with pro-slow *CT of success only long as the emotionality of a given situation does not exceed a certain critical degree. If the effective temperature rises this level, the of reason having any effect ceases and its place is taken by slogans and chimerical wish fantasies. That is to say, a sort of collective obsession results which rapidly develops into a psychic epidemic. Under these conditions all those elements whose existence is merely tolerated as astile under the rule of reason come to the top. Such individuals are by no means rare curiosities to meet with only in prisons and lunatic asylums. For every manifest case of insanity there are, in my estimation, at least 10 latent cases who seldom get to the point of breaking out openly but whose views and behavior, for all their appearance of normality, are influenced unconsciously by pathological and ICRV1N factors. There are, of no medical statistics on the frequency of latent psychoses for understandable reasons. But even if their numbed KR should amount to less than 10 times that of the manifest psychoses and of manifest criminality, the relatively small percentage of the violation figures they represent is more than compensated for by the peculiar dangerousness of these liopal. Their mental state is that of a collectively excited group ruled by affective judgments and wish fantasies. In a milieu of this kind they are the adapted ones, and consequently they feel quite at home in it. They know from their own experience the language of these conditions, and they know how to handle them. Their chimerical ideas, sustained by fanatical resentment, appeal to the collective irrationality and find fruitful soil there. They express all those motives and resentments which lurk in more normal people under the cloak of reason and insight. They are, therefore, despite their small number in comparison with the violation as a whole, dangerous as sources of infection precisely because the solid normal person possesses only a limited degree of self-knowledge. Most people confuse self-knowledge with knowledge of their conscious ego personalities. Anyone who has any consciousness at all takes it for granted that he knows himself. But the ego knows only its own contents, not the unconscious and its contents. People measure their self-knowledge by what the average person in their axial environment knows of himself, but not by the real psychic facts which are for the most part hidden from them. In this wrestle_RCT the caves like the of whose physiological and anatomical structure the average person knows very little to. Although he lives in it and with it, most of it is totally unknown to the layman, and special scientific knowledge is needed to acquaint consciousness with what is known of the not to of all that is not known, which also exists. What is commonly called self-knowledge is therefore a very limited knowledge. Most of it dependent on *real factors, of what bears on in the human psyche. Hence one is always coming up against the prejudice that such and such a thing dks not happen with us or in our family or among our friends and acquaintances. On the other hand, one meets with equally illusory assumptions atk.ut the alleged presence of qualities which merely serve to cover up the true facts of the case. In this broad TKLT of unconsciousness, which is immune to conscious criticism and control, we stand defenseless, 1kn to all kinds of influences and psychic infections. As with all dangers, we can guard against the risk of psychic infection only when we know what is attacking us, and how, where and when the attack will come. Since self-knowledge is a matter of getting to know the individual facts, theories are of very little help. For the more a theory lays claim to universal validity, the less capable it is of doing justice to the individual facts. Any theory based on experience is necessarily statistical. It formulates an ideal average which abolishes all exceptions at either end of the scale and replaces them by an abstract mean. This mean is quite valid, though it need not necessarily in reality. Despite this, it figures in the theory as an unassailable fundamental fact. The exceptions at either extreme, though equally factual, do not in the final result at all, since they cancel each other out. If, for instance, I determine the weight of each stone in a bed of and get an average weight of 5 ounces, this tells me very little the real nature of the L*Beebles. Anyone who thought, on the basis of these findings, that he could pick up a L*Beeble of 5 ounces at the first try would infer a serious disappointment. Indeed, it might well happen that however long he searched he would not find a single pebble weighing exactly 5 ounces. The statistical method Excel shows the facts in the light of the ideal average but not give us a picture of their empirical reality. While reflecting an indisputable of reality, it can falsify the actual truth in a renounced misleading way. This is particularly true of theories which are based on statistics. The distinctive thing it's not real facts, however, is their individuality. Not to put too fine a int on it, one could say that the real picture consists of nothing but exceptions to the rule, and that, in consequence, absolute reality has predominantly the character of irregularity. These considerations must in mind whenever there is talk of a theory serving as a guide to self-knowledge. There is and can be self-knowledge based on theoretical assumptions, for the object of this knowledge is an individual a relative exception and an irregular phenomenon. Hence it is not the universal and the regular that characterize the individual, but rather the unique. He is not to be understood as a recurrent unit but as something unique and singular which in the last analysis can be neither known nor compared with anything else. At the same time man, as member of a species, can and must be descriptored as a statistical unit, otherwise nothing general could be said _ut him. For this purpose he has to be regarded as a comparative unit. This results in a universally valid anthropology or psychology, as the case may be, with an abstract picture of man as an average unit from which all individual features have been removed, but it is these features which are of paramount importance for understanding man. If I want to understand an individual human being, I must lay aside all scientific knowledge of the average man and discard all theories in order to adopt a completely new and unprejudiced attitude. I can only approach the task of understanding with a free mind, whereas knowledge of man, or insight into human character, presupposes all sorts of knowledge about mankind in now whether it is a question of understanding a fellow human being or of self-knowledge, I must in LXTH cases leave all theoretical assumptions behind me. Since scientific knowledge not only enjoys universal esteem but, in the eyes of Mexlearn man, counts as the only intellectual and spiritual authority, understanding the individual obliges me to commit the lesa majest, so to speak, of turning a blind eye to scientific knowledge. This is a sacrifice not lightly made, for the scientific attitude cannot rid itself so easily of its sense of responsibility. And if the psychologist to be Undiscovered who wants not only to classify his patient scientifically but also to understand him as a human being, he is threatened with a conflict of duties between the two diametrically opposed and mutually exclusive attitudes of knowledge on the one hand and understanding on the other. This conflict cannot be solved by an either-or but only by a kind of two-way thinking, doing one thing while not losing sight of the other. In view of the fact that, in principle, the effective advantages of knowledge work reciprocally to the disadvantage of understanding, the judgment resulting therefrom is likely to something of a paradox. Judged scientifically, the individual is nothing but a unit which repeats itself ad infinitum and could just as well designated with a letter of the alphabet. For understanding, on the other hand, it is just the unique individual human being who, when stripped of all those conformities and regularities dear to the heart of the scientist, is the supreme and only real object of investigation. The doctor, above all, should be aware of this contradiction. On the one hand, he is equipped with the statistical truths of his scientific training. And on the other, he is faced with the task of treating a sick who, especially in the case of psychic suffering, requires individual understanding. The more schematic the treatment is, the more resistances it quite rightly calls up in the patient, and the more the cure is jeopardized. The psychotherapist sees himself willy-nilly to regard the individuality of a patient as an essential fact in the picture and to arrange his methods of treatment accordingly. Today, over the whole field of medicine, it is recognized that the task of the doctor consists in treating the sick person, not an abstract illness. This illustration from the realm of medicine is only a special instance of the problem of education and training in general. Education is based in the main on statistical truths and abstract knowledge and therefore imparts an unrealistic, rational picture of the world, in which the individual, as a merely marginal phenomenon, plays no role. The individual, however, as an irrational datum, is the true and authentic carrier of reality. The concrete man is to the unreal ideal or normal man to whom the scientific statements refer. What is more, most of the natural sciences try to represent the results of their investigations as though these had come into existence without man's intervention, in such a way that the collaboration of the psyche and indispensable factor remains invisible. An exception to this is molecular physics, which recognizes that the observed is not independent of the observer. In this respect as well, science conveys a picture of the world from which a real human psyche appears to be excluded, the very antithesis of the humanities. Under the influence of scientific assumptions, not only the psyche but the individual man and, indeed, all individual events suffer a leveling down in a process of blurring that distorts the picture of reality into a conceptual average. We ought not to underestimate the psychological effect of the statistical world picture. It thrusts aside the individual in favor of anonymous units that pile up into mass formations. Instead of the concrete individual, you have the names of organions and, at the highest FK, int, the abstract idea of the state as the principle of political reality. The moral responsibility of the individual is then inevitably replaced by the policy of the state, raison d'etat. Instead of moral and mental differentiation of the individual, you have public welfare and the raising of the living standard. The goal and meaning of individual life, which is the only real life, no longer lie in individual development but in the Y31IC of the state, which is thrust of J and the individual from outside and consists in the execution of an abstract idea which ultimately tends to attract all life to itself. The individual is increasingly deprived of the moral decision as to how he should live his own life, and instead is ruled, fed, clothed, and educated as a social unit, accommodated in the appropriate housing unit, and amused in accordance with the standards that give pleasure and satisfaction to the masses. The rulers, in their turn, are just as much units as the ruled, and are distinguished only by the fact that they are crystallized mouthpieces of the state doctrine. They do not need to be personalities capable of judgment, but thoroughgoing specialists who are unusable outside their line of business. State elicy decides what shall be taught and studied. The seemingly omnipotent state doctrine is for its part manipulated in the name of state lic by those occupying the highest positions in the government, where all the is concentrated. Whoever, by election, or caprice, gets into one of these positions is subject to no higher authority, he is the state itself and within the limits of the situation can at his own discretion. With Nuis 14 he can say, "L'état c'est moi." He is thus the only individual or, at any rate, one of the few individuals who could make use of their individuality if only they knew how to differentiate themselves from the state doctrine. They are more likely, however, to the slaves of their own fictions. Such one-sidedness is always counterbalanced psychologically by unconscious subversive tendencies. Slavery and rebellion are inseparable correlates. Hence, rivalry for and exaggerated distrust pervade the entire organism from top to eudern. Furthermore, in order to compensate for its chaotic formlessness, a mass always produces a leader, who infallibly becomes the victim of his own inflated ego consciousness, as numerous examples in history show. Underscore this development becomes logically unavoidable the moment the individual combines with the mass and thus renders himself apart from the agglomeration of huge masses in which the individual disappears anyway. One of the chief factors responsible for psychological mass-mindedness is scientific rationalism, which robs the individual of his foundations and his dignity. As a unit he has lost his individuality and become a mere abstract number in the Bureau of Statistics. He can only play the role of an interchangeable unit of infinitesimal importance. Looked at rationally and from outside, that is exactly what he is, and from this point of view it seems trivially absurd to go on talking about the value or meaning of the individual. Indeed, one can hardly imagine how one ever came to endow individual human life with so much dignity when the truth to the contrary is as plain as the palm of your hand. From this the individual really is of diminutive-ishing importance, and anyone who wishes to dispute this would find himself at a loss for arguments. The fact that the individual feels himself or the members of his family or the esteemed friends in his circle to be important merely underlines the slightly comic subjectivity of his feeling. For what are the few compared with 10,000 or 100,000, let alone a million? This recalls the argument of a thoughtful friend with whom I once got caught up in a huge crowd of suddenly he exclaimed, "Here you have the most convincing reason for not living in immortality, all that Lot wants to mortal. The bigger the crowd the more negligible the individual becomes. But if the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own puniness and immortance, should feel that his life has lost its meaning, which, after all, is not identical with public welfare and higher standards of living, then he is already on the road to state slavery and, without knowing or wanting it, has become its proselyte. The man who looks only outside and quails the big battalions has nothing with which to combat the evidence of his senses and his reason. But that is just what is ****. We are all fallen at and overawed by statistical truths and large numbers and are daily apprised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality, since it is not represented in by any mass organization. Conversely, those personages who strut on the world stage and whose voices are heard far and wide seem, to the uncritical to be trne along on some mass movement or on the tide of public opinion, and for this reason are either applauded or execrated. Since mass suggestion plays the predominant role here, it remains a LNCXT point whether their message is their own, for which they are personally responsible, or whether they merely function as a megaphone for collective opinion. Under these circumstances it is small wonder that individual judgment grows increasingly uncertain of itself and that responsibility is collectivized as much as possible, i.e., is shuffled off by the individual and delegated to a corporate LDY. In this way the individual becomes more and more a function of which in its turn usurps the function of the real-life carrier, whereas, in actual fact, society is nothing more than an abstract idea like the state. Both are hypostatic, that is, have become autonomous. The state in particular is turned into a quasi-animate personality from whom everything is in reality it is only a camouflage for those individuals who know how to manipulate it. Thus the constitutional state drifts into the situation of a primitive form of scriety, the communism, a primitive tribe where every XLY is subject to the autocratic rule of a chief or an oligarchy. Point 2. Religion as the counterbalance to mass-mindedness in order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of the chieftains who manipulate it from every wholesome restriction. All socio-political movements tending in this direction invariably try cut the ground from under religion. 4. In order to turn the individual into a function of the state, his dependence on anything else must be taken from him. Religion means dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of these do not refer directly to unial and physical conditions, they concern far more the individual's psychic attitude. But it is to have an attitude to the external conditions of life only when there is a of reference outside them. Religion gives, or claims to give, such a int, thereby enabling the individual to exercise his judgment and his power of decision. It builds up a reserve, as it were, against the obvious and inevitable force of circumstances to which everyone is exposed who lives only in the outer world and has no other ground under his feet except the pavement. If statistical reality is the only one, then that is the sole authority. There is then only one condition, and since no contrary condition exists, judgment and decision are not only superfluous but impossible. Then the individual is to be a function of statistics and hence a function of the state or whatever the abstract principle of order may be called. Religion, however, teaches another authority to that of the world. The doctrine of the individual's dependence on makes just as high a claim him as the world. It may even that the absoluteness of this claim estranges him from the world in the same way as he is estranged from himself when he succumbs to the collective mentality. He can forfeit his judgment and RWER of decision in the former case, for the sake of religious doctrine, quite as much as in the latter. This is the goal which religion aspires to unless it compromises with the state. When it does so, I prefer to call it not religion but a creed. A creed gives expression to a definite collective belief, whereas the word religion expresses a subjective relationship to certain metaphysical, extra-mundane factors. A creed is a confession of faith intended chiefly for the world at large and is thus an intramundane affair, while the meaning and purpose of religion lie in the relationship of the individual to God, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or to the path of salvation and liberation, Buddhism. From this basic fact all ethics is derived, which without the individual's responsibility before can called nothing more than conventional morality. Since they are compromises with mundane reality, the creeds have accordingly seen themselves obliged to undertake a progressive classification of their views, doctrines, and customs, and in so doing have externalized themselves to such an extent that the authentic religious element in them, the living relationship to and direct confrontation with their extra-mundane arent of reference, has been thrust into the background. The denominational measures the worth and importance of the subjective religious relationship by the yardstick of traditional doctrine, and where this is not so frequent, as in Protestantism, one immediately hears talk or pedism, sectarianism, eccentricity, and so forth, as SCK, and as anyone claims to guided by will. A creed coincides with the established church or, at any rate, forms a public institution whose members include not only true believers but vast of who can only described as indifferent in matters of religion and who do it simply by force of habit. Here the difference between a creed and a religion becomes palpable. To be the adherent of a creed, therefore, is not always a religious matter but more often a one and, as such, it nothing to give the individual any foundation. For this he has to depend exclusively on his relation to an authority which is not of this world. The criterion here is not lip service to a creed but the psychological fact that the life of the individual is not determined solely by the ego and its opinions or by social factors, but quite as much, if not more, by a transcendent entity. It is not ethical principles, however lofty, or creeds, however orthodox, that lay the foundations for the freedom and autonomy of the individual, but simply and solely the empirical awareness, the incontrovertible experience of an intensely sonal, reciprocal relationship between man and an extramundane authority which acts as a counterpoise to the world and its reason. This formulation will not please either the man or the collective, for the former, the of the state, is the supreme principle of thought and action. Indeed, this was the for which he was enlightened, and accordingly the mass man grants the individual a right to exist only in so far as he is a function of the state. The believer, on the other hand, while admitting that the state has a moral and factual claim on him, confesses to the tier leaf that not only man but the state that rules him is subject to the overlordship of God, and that, in case of doubt, the supreme decision will be made by and not by the state. Since I do not presume to any metaphysical judgments, I must leave it an open question whether the world, i.e., the phenomenal world of man, and hence nature in general, is the OW bite of or not. I can only into the fact that the opposition between these two realms of excellence is not only vouched for in the New Testament but is still exemplified very plainly today in the negative attitude of the dictator states to religion and of the church to atheism and materialism. Just as man, as a social train, cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real justification for his existence and his own spiritual and moral autonomy anywhere except in an extra-mundane principle capable of relativizing the overpowering influence of external factors. The individual who is not anchored in G11 can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. For this he needs the evidence of inner, transcendent experience which alone can protect him from the otherwise inevitable submersion in the mass. Merely intellectual or even moral insight into the stultification and moral irresponsibility of the mass man is a negation only and amounts to not much more than a wavering on the road to the atomization of the individual. It lacks the driving force of religious conviction, since it is merely rational. The dictator state has one great advantage over bourgeois reason. Along with the individual it swallows up his religious forces. The state takes the place of that is why, seen from this angle, the dictatorships are religions and state slavery is a form of worship. But the religious function cannot be dislocated and falsified in this way without giving rise to secret doubts, which are immediately repressed so as to avoid conflict with the prevailing trend towards mass-mindedness. The result, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanaticism, which in its turn is used as a weapon for stamping out the least flicker of opposition. Free opinion is stifled and moral decision ruthlessly suppressed, on the plea that the end justifies the means, even the vilest. The of the state is exalted to a creed, the leader or party becomes a demigod good and evil, and his votaries are honored as herps, martyrs, arcs missionaries. There is only one truth and side it no other. It is sacrosanct and above criticism. Anyone who thinks differently is a heretic, who, as we know from his Tory, is threatened with all manner of unpleasant things. Only the party boss, who holds the political in his hands, can interpret the state doctrine authentically, and he just as suits him. When, through mass rule, the individual becomes SEL unit no so and the state is elevated to the supreme principle, it is only to be expected that the religious function too will sucked into the maelstrom. Religion, as the careful observation and taking account of certain invisible and uncontrollable factors, is an instinctive attitude to man. And its manifestations can be followed all through human history. Its evident purpose is to maintain the psychic balance, for the natural man has an equally natural knowledge of the fact that his conscious functions may at any time thwarted by uncontrollable happenings coming from inside as well as from outside. For this reason he has always taken care that any difficult decision likely to have consequences for himself and others shall rendered safe by suitable measures of a religious nature. Offerings are made to the invisible bewares, formidable blessings are pronounced, and all kinds of solemn rites are performed. Wherein at all times there have been rites d'entrée et de sortie whose efficacy is impugned as magic and superstition by rationalists incapable of psychological insight. But magic has above all a psychological effect whose importance should not be underestimated. The performance of a magical action gives the son concerned a feeling of security which is absolutely essential for carrying out a decision, because a decision is inevitably somewhat one-sided and is therefore rightly felt to be a risk. Even a dictator thinks it necessary not only to accompany his acts of state with threats but to stage them with all manner of solemnities. Brass bands, flags, banners, parades, and monster demonstrations are no different in principle from ecclesiastical perquisitions, cannonades, and fireworks to scare off demons. Only, the suggestive parade of state engenders a collective feeling of security which, unlike religious demonstrations, gives the individual no protection against his inner demonism. Hence he will cling all the more to the power of the state, i.e., to the mass, thus delivering himself up to it psychically as well as morally and putting the finishing touch to his social depotentiation. The state, like the church, demands enthusiasm, self-sacrifice, and love, and if religion requires or presumes the fear of God, then the dictator state takes good care to provide the necessary terror. When the rationalist directs the main force of his attack against the miraculous effect of the right as asserted by tradition, he has in reality completely missed the mark. The essential int, the psychological effect, is overall ked, although both parties make use of it for directly opposite purposes. A similar situation prevails with regard to their respective conceptions of the goal. The goals of religion: deliverance from evil, reconciliation with rewards in the hereafter, and so on, turn into worldly promises about freedom from care for one's daily bread, the just distribution of material universal in the future, and shorter working hours. That the fulfillment of these promises is as far off as paradise only furnishes yet another analogy and underlines the fact that the masses have converted from an extra-mundane goal to a purely worldly belief, which is extolled with exactly the same religious fervor and exclusiveness that the creeds display in the other direction. In order not to rear it myself unnecessarily, I shall not enumerate all the parallels between worldly and otherworldly beliefs, but shall content myself with emphasizing the fact that a natural function which has existed from the beginning, like the religious function, cannot be dispensed of with rationalistic and so-called enlightened criticism. You can, of course, represent the doctrinal contents of the creeds as irreversible and subject them to ridicule, but such myths _ls miss the point and do not affect the religious function which forms the basis of the creeds. Religion, in the sense of conscientious regard for the irrational factors of the psyche and individual fate, remars evilly distort in the deification of the state and the dictator. Naturam expellas furcatamen usque recurrit. You can throw out nature with a pitchfork, but she'll always turn up again. The leaders and dictators, having weighed up the situation correctly, are therefore doing their best to gloss over the all-obvious parallel with the deification of Caesar and to hide their real histoire behind the fiction of the state, though this, of course, alters nothing. As I have already re-inted out, the dictator state, besides robbing the individual of his rights, has also cut the ground from under his feet psychically by depriving him of the metaphysical foundations of his existence. The ethical decision of the individual human being no longer counts. What alone matters is the blind movement of the masses, and the lie thus becomes the operative principle of political action. The state has drawn the logical conclusions from this, as the existence of many millions of state slaves completely deprived of all rights mutely testifies. Both the dictator state and denominational religion lay quite particular emphasis on the idea of community. This is the basic ideal of communism, and it is thrust down the throats of the so much that it has the exact opposite of the desired effect. It inspires divisive mistrust. The Church, which is no less emphatic, appears on its side as a communal ideal, and where the Church is notoriously weak, as in Protestantism, the avorina, communal experience, makes up for the painful lack of cohesion. As can easily seen, community is an indispensable aid in the organization of masses and is therefore a two-edged weapon. Just as the addition of however many one since this was written. In the spring a reaction in the USSR to state again. Zeros will never make a unit, so the value of a community depends on the spiritual and moral stature of the individuals composing it. For this reason one cannot expect from the community any effect that would outweigh the suggestive influence of the environment, that is, a real and fundamental change in individuals, whether for good or for bad. Such changes can come only from the personal encounter between man and man, but not from communistic or Christian baptisms en masse, which do not touch the inner man. How superficial the effect of communal propaganda actually is can be seen from recent events in Eastern Europe. The communal ideal reckons without its host, overlooking the individual human being, who in the end will assert his claims. Point 3. The position of the West on the question of religion confronting this development in the 20th century of our Christian era. The Western world stands with its heritage of Roman law, the treasures of Judeo-Christian ethics grounded on metaphysics, and its ideal of the inalienable rights of man. Anxiously it asks itself the question, how can this development be brought to a standstill or put into reverse? It is useless to pillory the scryolist dictatorship as utopian and to condemn its economic principles as unreasonable, because, in the first place, the criticizing West has only itself to talk to, its arguments being heard only on this side of the Iron Curtain, and, in the second place, any economic principles you like can put into practice so long as you are prepared to accept the sacrifices they entail. You can carry through any serial and economic reforms you please if, like Stalin, you let 3 million Irans starve to death and have a few million unpaid laborers at your disposal. A state of this kind has no social or economic crises to fear. So long as its power is intact, that is to say, so long as there is a well-disciplined and well-fed army in the offing, it can maintain its existence for an indefinitely long period and can go on increasing its power to an indefinite extent. Thanks to its excess birth rate, it can multiply the number of its unpaid workers almost at will in order to with its rivals, regardless of the world market, which is to a large measure dependent on wages. A real danger can come to it only from outside, through the threat of military attack. But this risk grows less every year, firstly because the war potential of the dictator states is steadily increasing, and secondly because the West cannot afford to a latent Russian or Chinese nationalism and chauvinism by an attack which would have exactly the opposite effect to the one intended. So far as one can see, only one possibility remains, and that civilization in transition is a breakdown of power from within, which must, however, be left to follow its own inner development. Any superiority from outside at present would have little effect, in view of the existing security measures and the danger of nationalistic reactions. The absolute state has an army of fanatical missionaries to do its bidding in matters of foreign policy, and in their turn can count on a fifth column who are guaranteed asylum under the laws and constitutions of the Western states. In addition, the communes of very strong in places, considerably weaken Western governments of decision, whereas the West has no opportunity to exert a similar influence on the other side, though we are probably not wrong in surmising that there is a certain amount of opposition among the masses in the East. There are always upright and truth-loving to whom lying and tyranny are hateful, but one cannot judge whether they exert any decisive influence on the masses under the Belice regimes. In view of this uncomfortable situation, the question is heard again and again in the West, what can we do to counter this threat from the East? Even though the West has considerable industrial MWER and a sizable defense potential at its command, we cannot rest content with this, for we know that even the biggest armaments and the heaviest industry coupled with a relatively high living standard are not enough to check the psychic infection spread by religious fanaticism. The West has unfortunately not yet woken up to the fact that our emerald to idealism and and other desirable virtues delivered with so much enthusiasm, is mere bombination in the void. It is a puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith, however twisted this faith may appear to us. We are faced, not with a situation that can overcome by rational or moral arguments, but with an unleashing of emotional forces and ideas engendered by the spirit of the times, and these, as we know from experience, are not much influenced by rational reflection and still less by moral exhortation. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmac, the antidote, should in this case an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude recent in Poland and Hungary could have grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. Unhappily, the little word should, which never fails to in this connection, points to a certain weakness, if not the absence, of this desideratum. Not only does the West lack a uniform faith that could block the progress of a fanatical ideologue vf, but, as the father of Marxist philosophy, it makes use of exactly the same intellectual assumptions, the same arguments and aims. Although the churches in the West enjoy full freedom, they are not less full or empty than in the East. Yet they exercise no noticeable influence on the broad course of FX, politics. The disadvantage of a creed as a public institution is that it serves two masters. On the one hand, it derives its existence from the relationship of man to God, and on the other hand, it owes a duty to the state, i.e., to the world, in which connection it can appeal to the saying "Render unto Caesar," and various other admonitions in the New Testament. In early times and until comparatively recently there was, therefore, talk of wares ordained by God, Romans 13:1. Today this conception is antiquated. The churches stand for traditional and collective convictions which in the case of many of their adherents are no longer based on their own inner but on unreflecting belief, which is notoriously apt to disappear as sckjn as one turns thinking about it. The content of belief then comes into collision with knowledge, and it often turns out that the irrationality of the former is no match for the ratiocinations of the latter. Belief is no adequate substitute for inner experience, and where this is absent even a strong faith which came miraculously as a gift of grace may depart equally miraculously. People call faith the true religious experience, but they do not stop to consider that actually it is a secondary phenomenon arising from the fact that something happened to us in the first place which instilled into us, that is, trust and loyalty. This has a definite content that can be interpreted in terms of one or other of the denominational creeds. But the more this is so, the more the possibilities of these conflicts with knowledge mount up, which in themselves are quite, that is to say, the standment of the creeds is archaic. They are full of impressive mythological symbolism which, if taken literally, comes into insufferable conflict with knowledge. But if, for instance, the statement that Christ rose from the dead is to not literally but symbolically, then it is capable of various interpretations that do not conflict with knowledge and do not impair the meaning of the statement. The objection that understanding it symbolically puts an end to the Christians of immortality is invalid, because long before the coming of Christianity mankind early believed in a life after death and therefore had no need of the Easter event as a guarantee of immortality. The danger that a mythology literally, and as taught by the Church, will suddenly be repudiated stock and barrel is greater than ever. Is it not time that the Christian mythology, instead of being wiped out, was understood simultaneously for once? It is still early to say what might the consequences of a general recognition of the fatal parallelism between the state religion of the Marxists and the state religion of the Church. The absolutist claim of a civitas Dei that is represented by man an unfortunate resemblance to the divinity of the state, and the moral conclusion drawn by Ignatius from the authority of the Church, the end sanctifies the means, anticipates the lie as a political instrument in an exceedingly dangerous way. Both demand unqualified submission to faith and thus curtail man's freedom, the one his freedom before God and the other his freedom before the state, thereby digging the grave for the individual. The fragile existence of this, so far as we know, unique carrier of life is threatened on both sides, despite their promises of spiritual and material idols to come. And how many of us can in the long run fight against the proverbial llama of, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush? Besides which, the West cherishes the same scientific and rationalistic Weltanschauung with its statistical level down tendency and materialistic aims as the state religion of the Eastern, as I have explained. What, then, has the West, with its political and denominational schisms, to offer to modern man in his need? Nothing, unfortunately. Except a variety of paths all leading to one goal which is practically indistinguishable from the Marxist ideal. It requires no special effort of understanding to see where the communist ideology gets the certainty of its belief that time is on its side, and that the world is for conversion. The facts walk a language that is all plain in this respect. It will not help us in the West to shut our eyes to this and not recognize our fatal vulnerability. Anyone who has once learned to submit absolutely to a collective belief and to renounce his eternal right to freedom and the equally eternal duty of individual responsibility will in this attitude, and will be able to march with the same credulity and the same lack of criticism in the reverse direction. If another and manifestly better is foisted upon his alleged idealism. What happened not so long ago to a civilized European nation? We accuse the Germans of having forgotten it all again already, but the truth is that we don't know for certain whether something similar might not elsewhere. It would not surprising if it did, and if another civilized nation succumbed to the infection of a uniform and one-sided idea. We exremit ourselves the question, which countries have the biggest communist parties? America, which qui mutatio the real political backbone of Western Europe's, seems to 1k immune because of the outspoken counterposition she has adopted, but in point of fact she is even more vulnerable than, since her educational system is the most influenced by the scientific Weltanschauung with its statistical truths, and her mixed population finds it difficult to strike rcyts in a soil that is practically without history. The historical and humanistic tire of education so sorely needed in such circumstances leads, on the contrary, a Cinderella existence. Though Eurolar possesses this latter requirement, she uses it to her own undoing in the form of nationalistic egoisms and paralysing common to both is the materialistic and collectivist goal, and lack the very thing that expresses and grips the whole man, namely, an idea which puts the individual human iring in the center as the measure of all things. This idea alone is enough to arouse the most violent doubts and resistances on all sides, and one could almost go so far as to assert that the valuelessness of the individual in comparison with large numbers is the one belief that meets with universal and unanimous assent. To be sure, we all say that this is the century of the common man. That he is the lord of the earth, the air, and the water, and that on his decision hangs the historical fate of the nations. This proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion and is counterbalanced by a reality that is very different. In this reality man is the slave and victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. He is intimidated and endangered by the might of the military technology which is said to safeguard his physical existence, his spiritual and moral freedom, though guaranteed in limits in one half of his world, is threatened with chaotic disorientation, and in the other half is abolished finally. To add comedy to tragedy, this lord of the elements, this universal arbiter, hugs to his bosom notions which stamp his dignity as worthless and turn his autonomy into an absurdity. All his achievements and obsessions do not make him bigger, on the contrary, they diminish him, as the fate of the factory worker under the rule of a just distribution of GGS clearly demonstrates. He for his share of the factory with the loss of personal property, he exchanges his freedom of movement for the doubtful pleasure of eking tied to his place of employment. He forfeits all means of improving his position if he jibs against being ground down by exhausting piecework. And if he shows any signs of intelligence, precepts are thrust down his throat with a bit of technical knowledge thrown in, if he is lucky. However, over one's head and a daily feed for the useful animal are not to be sneezed at when the bare necessities of life may be cut off from one day to the next. Point 4. The individual's understanding of himself. It is astounding that man, the instigator, inventor, and vehicle of all these developments, the originator of all judgments and decisions and the planner of the future, must make himself such a quantity negligible. The contradiction, the paradoxical evaluation of humanity by man himself, is in truth a matter for wonder, and one can only explain it as springing from an extraordinary uncertainty of judgment. In other words, man is an enigma to himself. This is understandable, seeing that he lacks the means of comparison necessary for self-knowledge. He knows how to distinguish himself from the other animals of anatomy and physiology, but as a science, reflecting being, gifted with speech, he lacks all criteria for self-judgment. He is on this planet a unique phenomenon which he cannot compare with anything else. The possibility of comparison and hence of self-knowledge would arise only if he could establish relations with quasi-human mammals inhabiting other stars. Until then man must continue to resemble a hermit who knows that in respect of comparative anatomy he has amenities with the anthropary, It's but, to judge by appearances, is extraordinarily different from his cousins in respect of his psyche. It is just in this most important characteristic of his species that he cannot know himself and therefore remains a mystery to him. Self. The differing degrees of self-knowledge within his own SFR size are of little significance compared with the possibilities which would be opened out by an encounter with a creature of similar structure but different origin. Our psyche, which is primarily responsible for all the historical changes wrought by the hand of man on the face of this planet, remains an insoluble puzzle and an incomprehensible wonder, an object of abiding feature it shares with all nature's secrets. In regard to the latter we still have hope of making more discoveries and finding answers to the most difficult questions. But in regard to the psyche and psychology there seems to be a curious hesitancy. Not only is it the youngest of the empirical instances, but it has great difficulty in getting anywhere near its pro-FRR object. In the same way that our picture of the world had to be freed by C. Ornicus from the prejudice of geocentricity, the most strenuous efforts of a well-nigh revolutionary nature were needed to free psychology, first from the spell of mythological ideas, and then from the prejudice that the psyche is, on the one hand, a mere epiphenomenon of a biochemical percuss in the brain and, on the other hand, a purely personal matter. The connection with the brain not in itself prove that the is an epiphenomenon, a secondary function causally dependent on biochemical processes in the physical substrate. Nevertheless, we know only too well how much the psychic function can be disturbed by verifiable processes in the brain, and this fact is so impressive that the subsidiary nature of the psyche seems an almost unavoidable inference. The phenomena of parapsychology, however, warn us to be careful, for they do a relativization of space and time through factors which casts doubt on our naive and over-hasty explanation in terms of psychophysical parallelism. For the sake of this explanation deny the findings of parapsychology outright, either for philosophical reasons or from intellectual laziness. This can hardly be considered a scientifically responsible attitude, even though it is a way out of a quite extraordinary intellectual difficulty. To assess the psychic phenomenon, we have to take account of all the other phenomena that go with it. And accordingly we can no longer practice any psychology that ignores the existence of the unconscious or of parapsychology. The structure and physiology of the brain furnish no explanation of the psychic process. The psyche has a peculiar nature which cannot be reduced to anything else. Like physiology, it presents a relatively self-contained field of experience, to which we must attribute a quite special importance because it includes one of the two indispensable conditions for existence as such, namely, the phenomenon of consciousness. Without consciousness there would, practically be no world, for the world exists for us only in far as it is consciously reflected by a psyche. Consciousness is a precondition of being. Thus the psyche is endowed with the dignity of a cosmic principle, which philosophically and in fact gives it a position co-equal with the principle of physical being. The carrier of this consciousness is the individual, who does not prince the psyche of his own volition but is, on the contrary, preformed by it and nourished by the gradual awakening of consciousness during childhood. If therefore the psyche is of overriding empirical importance, so is the individual, who is the only immediate manifestation of the psyche. This fact must expressly emphasized for two reasons. Firstly, the individual psyche, just because of its individuality, is an exception to the statistical rule and is therefore robbed of one of its main characteristics when subjected to the leveling influence of statistical evaluation. Secondly, the churches grant it validity only insofar as it acknowledges their dogmas, in other words, when it submits to a collective category. In both cases the will to individuality is regarded as egotistic obstinacy. Devalues this as subjectivism, and the churches condemn it morally as heresy and spiritual pride. As to the latter charge, it should not be forgotten that, unlike other religions, Christianity holds up before us a symbol whose content is the individual way of life of a man, the Son of Man, and that it even regards this individuation perkness as the incarnation and revelation of God Himself. Hence the development of man into a self acquires a significance whose full implications have hardly begun to appreciated, because too much attention to externals blocks the way to immediate inner excellence. Were not the autonomy of the individual the secret longing of many people, it would scarcely be able to survive the collective suppression either morally or spiritually. All these obstacles make it more difficult to arrive at a correct appreciation of the human psyche, but they count for very little beside one other remarkable fact that deserves mentioning. This is the common psychiatric experience that the devaluation of the psyche and other resistances to psychological enlightenment are based in large measure on panic fear of the discoveries that might be made in the realm of the unconscious. These fears are found not only among FRRSons who are frightened by the picture Freud painted of they also troubled the originator of psychoanalysis himself, who confessed to me that it was necessary to make a dogma of his sexual theory because this was the sole bulwark of reason against a possible eruption of the black of occultism. In these words Freud was expressing his conviction that the unconscious still harbored many things that might lend themselves to occult interpretation, as is in fact the case. These archaic vestiges, or archetypal forms grounded on the instincts and giving expression to them, have a numinous quality that sometimes arouses fear. They are ineradicable, for they represent the ultimate foundations of the psyche itself. They cannot be grasped intellectually, and when one has destroyed one manifestation of them, they reappear in altered form. It is this fear of the unconscious psyche which not only immerses self-knowledge, but is the gravest obstacle to a wider understanding and knowledge of psychology. Often the fear is so great that one dares not admit it even to oneself. This is a question which every religious person should consider very seriously. He might get an illuminating answer. A scientifically oriented psychology is bound to abstractly, that is, it removes itself just sufficiently far from its object not to lose sight of it altogether. That is why the findings of laboratory psychology are, for all practical purposes, often so remarkably unenlightening and devoid of interest. The more the individual object dominates the field of vision, the more practical, detailed, and alive will be the knowledge derived from it. This means that the objects of investigation, too, become more and more complicated and that the uncertainty of the individual factors grows into their number, thus increasing the of error. Understandably enough, academic psychology is scared of risk and prefers to avoid complex situations by asking ever simpler questions, which it can do with impunity. It has full freedom in the choice of questions it will put to nature. Medical psychology, on the other hand, is very far from being in this more or less enviable position. Here the object puts the question and not the experimenter. The analyst is confronted with facts which are not of his choosing and which he probably never would choose if he were a free agent. It is the sickness or the patient himself that puts the crucial questions, in other words, nature with the d-duster and exi*ting an answer from him. The uniqueness of the individual and of his situation stares the analyst in the face and demands an answer. His duty as a physician forces him to with a situation swarming with uncertainty factors. At first he will apply principles based on general experience, but he will realize that principles of this kind do not adequately express the facts and fail to meet the nature of the case. The deeper his understanding penetrates, the more the general principles lose their meaning. But these principles are the foundation of objective knowledge and the yardstick by which it is measured. With the growth of what both patient and doctor feel to understanding, the situation becomes increasingly subjectivized. What was an advantage to begin with threatens to turn into a dangerous disadvantage. Subjectivation, in technical terms, transference and countertransference, creates isolation from the environment, a key limitation which neither party wishes for but which invariably sets in when understanding predominates and is no longer balanced by knowledge. As understanding deepens, the further removed it comes from knowledge. An ideal understanding would ultimately result in each party's unthinkingly going along with the other's experience, a state of uncritical passivity coupled with the most complete subjectivity and lack of social responsibility. Understanding carried to such lengths is in any case impossible, for it would require the virtual identification of two different individuals. Or later the relationship reaches a point where one partner feels he is being forced to sacrifice his own individuality so that it may assimilated by that of the other. This inevitable consequence breaks the understanding. For understanding also presupposes the integral preservation of the individuality of partners. It is therefore advisable to carry understanding only to the point where the balance between understanding and knowledge is reached, for understanding at all costs is injurious to both partners. This problem arises whenever complex individual situations have to be known, and it is the specific task of the medical psychologist to provide just this knowledge and understanding. It would also be the task of the director of conscience, zealous in the cure of souls, were it not that his office inevitably obliges him to apply the yardstick of his denominational bias at the critical moment. As a result, the individual's right to exist as such is cut short by a elective praejudice and often curtailed in the most sensitive area. The only time this does not happen is when the dogmatic SYMLXJL, for instance the life of Christ, is under stock slow concretely and felt by the individual to be adequate. How far this is the case today would prefer to leave to the judgment of others. At all events, the analyst very often has to treat patients to whom denominational limitations mean little or nothing. His profession therefore compels him to have as few preconceptions as similarly, while respecting metaphysical, i.e., non-verifiable, convictions and assertions, he will take care not to credit them with universal validity. This caution is called for because the individual traits of the patient's personality ought not to be twisted out of shape by arbitrary interventions from outside. The analyst must leave this to environmental influences, to the patient's own inner development, and in the widest sense to fate with its wise or unwise decrees. Many will perhaps find this heightened caution exaggerated. In view of the fact, however, that there is in any case such a multitude of reciprocal influences at work in the dialectical process between two individuals, even if it is conducted with the most tactful reserve, the responsible analyst will refrain from adding unnecessarily to the collective factors to which his patient has already succumbed. Moreover, he knows very well that the preaching of even the worthiest precepts only provokes the patient into open hostility or secret resistance and thus needlessly endangers the aim of the treatment. The psychic situation of the individual is so menaced nowadays by advertising, propaganda, and other more or less well-meant advice and suggestions that for once in his life the patient might be offered a relationship that does not repeat the nauseating you should, you must and similar confessions of inwardness. Against the onslaught from outside no less than against its repercussions in the psyche of the individual the analyst sees him self-obliged to play the role of counsel for the defense. Fear that anarchic instincts will thereby be let is a possibility that is greatly exaggerated, seeing that obvious safeguards exist within and without. Above all, there is the natural cowardice of most men to be reckoned with, not to mention morality, taste, and last but not least this fear is nothing compared with the enormous effort it usually costs people to help the first stirrings of individuality into consciousness, let alone put them into effect. And where these individual impulses have broken through boldly and unthinkingly, the analyst must protect them from the patient's own clumsy recourse to short-sightedness, ruthlessness, and cynicism. As the dialectical discussion is reached when an evaluation of these individual impulses necessary. By that time the patient should have acquired enough certainty of judgment to enable him to act on his own insight and decision and not from the mere wish to copy convention even if he happens to agree with collective opinion. Unless he stands firmly on his own feet, the so-called objective values profit him nothing, since they then only serve as a substitute for character and so help to suppress his individuality. Naturally, needy has an indisputable right to protect itself against errant subjectivisms, but, insofar as is itself composed of individual human beings, it is completely at the mercy of ruthless individualists. Let it band together into groups and organizations as much as it likes, it is just this banding together and the resultant extinction of the individual personality that makes it succumb so readily to a dictator. A million zeros joined together do not, unfortunately, add up to one. Ultimately everything depends on the quality of the individual, But our fatally short-sighted age thinks only in terms of large and mass organizations, though one would think that the world had seen more than enough of what a well-disciplined mob can do in the hands of a single madman. Unfortunately, this realization does not seem to have penetrated very far, and our blindness is extremely dangerous. People go on blithely organizing and believing in the sovereign remedy of mass action, without the least consciousness of the fact that the most powerful organizations can be maintained only by the greatest ruthlessness of their leaders and the cheerst of slogans. Curiously enough, the churches want to avail themselves of action in order to cast out the devil with Beelzebub, the very churches whose care is the salvation of the individual soul. They do not _are to have heard of the elementary axiom of mass psychology that the individual becomes morally and spiritually inferior in the mass, and for this reason they do not bother themselves overmuch with their real task of helping the individual to achieve a metanoia, a rebirth of the spirit deo concedent. It is, unfortunately, only clear that if the individual is not truly regenerated in spirit, society cannot be either. Variety is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption. I can therefore see it only as a delusion when the churches try, as they apparently do, to roll the individual into some social organization and reduce him to a condition of diminished responsibility, instead of raising him out of the torpid, mindless mass and making clear to him that he is the one factor and that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. It is true that mass meetings parade these ideas before him and seek to impress them on his mind by dint of mass suggestion, with the melancholy result that once the intoxication has worn off, the mass man promptly succumbs to another even more obvious and still louder slogan. His individual relation to God would be an effective shield against these influences. Did Christ call his disciples to him at a mass meeting? Did the feeding of the 5,000 bring him any followers who did not afterwards cry with the rest, "Crucify him," when even the rock named Peter showed signs of wavering? And are not Jesus and Paul prototypes of those who, trusting their inner experience, have gone their individual ways in defiance of the world? This argument should certainly not cause us to overlook the reality of the situation confronting the Church. When the Church tries to give to the amorphous mass by uniting individuals into a community of believers and to hold such an organization together with the help of suggestion, it is not only performing a great social service, but it also secures for the individual the inestimable of a meaningful form of life. These, however, are gifts which as a rule only confirm certain tendencies and do not change them. As experience unfortunately shows, the inner man remains unchanged however much community he has. His environment cannot give him as a gift something which he can win for himself only with effort and suffering. On the contrary, a favorable environment merely strengthens the dangerous tendency to expect everything from outside, even that metamorphosis which external reality cannot provide. By this I mean a far-reaching change of the inner man, which is all the more urgent in view of the mass phenomena of and the still greater problems of over-expulsion in the future. It is time we asked ourselves exactly what we are lumping in mass organizations and what constitutes the nature of the individual human, i.e., of the real man and not the statistical man. This is hardly hissable except by a new paradox of self-renection. All mass movements, as one might slip with the great ease down an inclined plane made up of large numbers, where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must of course be true, what the many want must be worth striving for, and necessary, and therefore go slow. In the clamour of the many resides the MWER to snatch wish fulfillments by force, sweetest of all, however, is that gentle and painless ping back into the kingdom of childhood, into the paradise of parental care, into happy-go-luckiness and irresensibility. All the thinking and looking after are done from the top. To all questions there is an answer, and for all needs the necessary provision is made. The infantile dream state of the mass man is so unrealistic that he never thinks to ask who is paying for this paradise. The balancing of accounts is left to a higher or authority, which welcomes the task, for its power is thereby increased, and the more LWER it has, the weaker and more helpless the individual becomes. Whenever societal conditions of this develop on a large scale, the road to tyranny lies open and the freedom of the individual turns into spiritual and physical slavery. Since every tyranny is ipso facto immoral and ruthless, it has much more freedom in the choice of its methods than an institution which still takes account of the individual. Should such an institution come into conflict with the organized state, it is made aware of the very real disadvantage of its morality and therefore feels compelled to avail itself of the same methods as its tenant. In this way the evil spreads almost of necessity, even when direct infection might avoid it. The danger of infection is greater when decisive importance is attached to large numbers and to statistical values, as is everywhere the case in our Western world. The suffocating power of the masses is paraded for our eyes in one form or another every day in the news. Palex rs, and the insignificance of the individual is rubbed into him so thoroughly that he loses all of making himself heard. The outworn ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité help him not at all, as he can direct this appeal only to his executioners, the svxkesmen of the masses. Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. I fully realize that this PR01 excitation must sound well nigh unintelligible to the man of Tkule. The helpful medieval view that man is a mikrite a reflection of the great cosmos in miniature, has long since quadrupled away from him, although the very existence of his worn-embracing and world-conditioning psyche might have taught him better. Not only is the image of the Mikrikrism imprinted on his psychic nature, but he also creates this image for himself on an ever-widening scale. He this cosmic, correspondence, within him by virtue of his reflecting consciousness on the one hand, and, on the other, thanks to the hereditary, archetypal nature of his instincts, which bind him to his environment. But his instincts not only attach him to they also, in a sense, tear him apart, because his desires pull him in different directions. In this way he falls into continual conflict with himself and only very rarely succeeds in giving his life an undivided goal for which, as a rule, he must pay very dearly by repressing other sides of his nature. One often has to ask oneself whether this kind of single-mindedness is worth forcing at all, that the natural state of the human psyche consists in a jostling together of its and in their contradictory behavior, that is, in a certain degree of disquisition. The Buddhist name for this is attachment to the 10,000 things. Such a condition cries out for order and synthesis. Just as the chaotic movements of the crowd, all ending in mutual frustration, are impelled in a definite direction by a dictatorial will, so the individual in his dissociated state needs a directing and ordering principle. Ego consciousness would like to let its own will play this role, but overlooks the existence of powerful unconscious factors which thwart its intentions. If it wants to reach the goal of synthesis, it must first get to know the nature of these factors. It must experience them, or else it must possess a numinous symbol that expresses them and leads to their synthesis. A religious symbol that comprehended and visibly represented what is seeking expression in Xlearn man might possibly do this, but our conception of the Christian symbol to date has certainly not been able to do so. On the contrary, that frightful world split runs right through the domains of the Christian white man. And our Christian outlook on life has proved powerless to prevent the recrudescence of an archaic order like communism. This is not to say that Christianity is finished. I am, on the contrary, convinced that it is not Christianity, but our conception and interpretation of it, that has become antiquated in face of the present world situation. The Christian symbol is a living thing that carries in itself the seeds of further development. It can go on developing, it depends only on us, whether we can make up our minds to meditate again, and more thoroughly, on the Christian premises. This requires a very different attitude towards the individual, towards the microcosm of the self, from the one we have adopted hitherto. That is why nobody knows what ways of approach are to man, what inner experiences he could still pass through, and what psychic facts underlie the religious myth. Over all this hangs so universal a darkness that no one can see why he should be interested or to what end he should commit himself. Before this problem we stand helpless. This is not surprising, since practically all the trump cards are in the hands of our opponents. They can appeal to the big battalions and their crushing power. politics, science, and technology stand ranged on their side. The imposing arguments of science represent the highest degree of intellectual certainty yet achieved by the mind of man. So at least it seems to the man of today, who has received hundredfold enlightenment concerning the backwardness and darkness of past ages and their superstitions. That his teachers have themselves gone seriously astray by making false comparisons between incommensurable factors never enters his head. All the more so as the intellectual elite to whom he puts his questions are almost unanimously agreed that what science regards as impossible was impossible at all other times as well. Above all, the facts of faith, which might give him the chance of an extra-mundane standpoint, are treated in the same context as the facts of science. Thus, when the individual questions the churches and their slavesmen, to whom is entrusted the cure of souls, he is informed that to belong to a church, a decidedly worldly institution, is more or less de rigueur, that the facts of faith which have become questionable for him were concrete historical events, that certain ritual actions miraculous effects, and that the sufferings of Christ have vicariously saved him from sin and its consequences, i.e., eternal damnation. If, with the limited means at his disposal, he begins to reflect on these things, he will have to confess that he does not understand them at all, and that only two possibilities remain to him, either to believe implicitly, or to reject such statements because they are flatly incomprehensible. Whereas the man of today can easily think about and understand all the truths dished out to him by the state, his understanding of religion is made considerably more difficult owing to the lack of explanations. Do you understand what you are reading? And he said, How can someone guides me? Acts 8:30. If, despite this, he has still not discarded all his religious convictions, this is because the religious impulse rests on an instinctive basis and is therefore a specifically human function. You can take away a man's gods, but only to give him others in return. The leaders of the mass state could not help deified. And wherever crudities of this kind have not yet been put over by force, obsessive factors arise in their stead, charged with demonic energy, money, work, political influence, and so forth. When any natural human function gets lost, i.e., is denied conscious and intentional expression, a general disturbance results. Hence, it is quite natural that with the triumph of reason a general neuroticizing of modern man should set in, of analogous to the splitting of the world lay by the Iron Curtain. This boundary line bristling with barbed wire runs through the psyche of slurn man, no matter on which side he lives. And just as the typical neurotic is unconscious of his shadow side, so the normal individual, like the neurotic, sees his shadow in his nail amur or in the man beyond the great divide. It has even licorn a hilitical and scryal duty to alstrophize the capitalismo of the one and the communism of the other as the very devil, as to fascinate the outward eye and prevent it from being king within. But just as the neurotic, despite unconsciousness of his other side, has a dim premonition that is not well with his laic economy, so Western man has devil-kefel an instinctive interest in his psyche and in psychology. Thus it is that the psychiatrist is summoned willy-nilly to appear on the world stage, and questions are addressed to him which primarily concern the most intimate and hidden life of the individual, but which in the last analysis are the direct effects of the zeitgeist. Because of its leersonal symptomatology, this material is usually considered to be rightly so, since it is made up of infantile fantasies which ill accord with the contents of an adult psyche and are therefore repressed by our moral judgment, in so far as they reach consciousness at all. Most fantasies of this kind do not, in the nature of things, come to consciousness in any form, and it is very improbable, to say the least of it, that they were ever conscious and were consciously repressed. Rather, they seem to have been present from the beginning, or, at any rate, to have arisen unconsciously and to have existed in that state until the psychologist's intervention enabled them to cross the threshold of consciousness. The activation of unconscious fantasies is a process that occurs when consciousness finds itself in a situation of distress. Were that not, the fantasies would be produced normally and would then bring no neurotic disturbances in their train. In reality, Fantasies of this kind belong to the world of child Hoxlow and give rise to disturbances only when prematurely strengthened by abnormal conditions of life. This is particularly likely to when unfavorable influences emanate from the parents, eliciting the and producing conflicts which upset the psychic balance of the child. When a neurosis breaks out in an adult, the fantasy world of child Hoxlow and one is tempted to explain the onset of the neurosis causally, as due to the presence of infantile fantasies. But that not explain why the fantasies did not develop any pathological effects during the interim. These effects develop only when the individual is faced with a situation which he cannot overcome by conscious means. The result? And standstill in the development of personality is loose. For infantile fantasies, which, of course, are latent in everybody but do not display any activity so long as the consciousity can continue on its way unaffected. When the fantasies reach a certain level of intensity, they begin to break through into consciousness and create a conflict situation that becomes experceptible to the patient himself, splitting him into two sonalities with different characters. The however, had been prepared long TK4 in the unconscious. When the energy flowing off from consciousness, TN cause unused, rain. Forced the negative qualities of the unconscious and particularly the infantile traits of the EK personality. Since the normal fantasies of a child are nothing other, at titum, than the imagination of the instincts, and may thus regarded as preliminary exercises in the use of future conscious activities, it follows that the fantasies of the neurotic, even though pathologically altered and perhaps reverted by the regression of energy, contain a core of normal instinct, the hallmark of which is adaptedness. A neurotic illness always implies an unadapted alteration and distortion of normal dynamisms and of the imagination proper to them. Instincts, however, are highly conservative and of extreme antiquity as regards 1k, their dynamism and their form. Their form, when represented to the mind, appears as an image which expresses the nature of the instinctive impulse visually and concretely, like a picture. If we could 100k into the psyche of the yucca moth L for instance, we would find in it a pattern of ideas, of a numinous or fascinating character, which not only compels the moth to carry out its fertilizing activity on the yucca plant but helps it to recognize the total situation. Instinct is anything but a blind and indefinite impulse, since it proves to attuned and adapted to a definite external situation. This latter circumstance gives it its specific and irreducible form. Just as instinct is original and hereditary, so, too, its form is age-old. That is to say, archetypal. It even older and more conservative than the body's form. These biological considerations naturally apply also to Homo sapiens, who still remains within the framework of gen. This is a classic instance of the of-and plant. The Neanderthal biology despite the p-cession of consciousness, will, and reason. The fact that our conscious activity is an instinct and derives from it its dynamism as well as the basic features of its ideational forms has the same significance for human psychology as for all other of the animal kingdom. IIU. Man knowledge consists essentially in the constant adaptation of the primordial patterns of ideas that were given us. These need certain because, in their original form, they are suited to an archaic RNCXLE of life but not to the demands of a differentiated environment. If the flow of instinctive dynamism into our life is to be maintained, as is absolutely necessary for our existence, then it is imperative that we should remold these archetypal forms into ideas which are adequate to the challenge of the present. Point 5. The philosophical and the psychological approach to life. Our ideas have, however, the unfortunate but inevitable tendency to lag the changes in the total situation. They can hardly do otherwise, so long as nothing changes in the world, they remain more or less adapted and therefore function in a satisfactory way. There is then no cogent reason why they should changed and adapted anew. Only when conditions have altered so drastically that there is an unendurable rift between the outer situation and our ideas, now become antiquated, does the general problem of our Weltanschauung, or philosophy of life, arise, and with it the question of how the primordial images that maintain the flow of instinctive energy are to be reoriented or readapted. They cannot simply be replaced by a new rational configuration, for this would molded too much by the outward situation and not enough by man's biological needs. Moreover, not only would it build no bridge to the original man, but it would blck the approach to him altogether. This is in keeping with the aims of Marxist education, which seeks, like to remake man, but in the image of the state. Today, our basic convictions are increasingly rationalistic. Our philosophy is no longer a way of life, as it was in antiquity. It has turned into an exclusively intellectual and academic exercise. Our denominational religions with their archaic rites and conceptions justified enough in themselves express a view of the world which caused no great difficulties in the Middle Ages but has become strange and unintelligible to modern man. Despite this conflict with them, scientific out lcx, a deep instinct bids him hang on to ideas which, if taken literally, leave out of account all the mental developments of the last 500 years. The obvious of this is to prevent him from falling into the abyss of nihilistic despair. Beethoven, when, as a rationalist, he feels IMIX11 ed to criticize denomi national religion as literalistic, narrow-minded, and obsolescent, he should never forget that it whose TN.ls, although their interpretation may be disputed, nevertheless rejects a life of their own by virtue of their archetypal character. Consequently, intellectual understanding is by no means indispensable in all cases, but is called for only when evaluation through feeling and intuition not suffice, that is to say, in the of people for whom the intellect carries the prime power of conviction. Nothing is more characteristic and symptomatic in this respect than the gulf that has 01 kned out between faith and knowledge. The contrast has become so enormous that one is obliged to speak of the incommensurability of these two categories and their way of looking at the world. And yet they are concerned with the same empirical world in which we live, for even the theologians tell us that faith is by facts that came historically perceptible in this known world of ours, namely that Christ was born as a real human being, worked many miracles and suffered his fate, died under Pontius Pilate, and rose up in the flesh after his death. Theology rejects any tendency to take the of its earliest records as written myths and, accordingly, to understand them symbolically. Indeed, it is the theologians themselves who have recently made the attempt, no doubt as a concession to the object of their faith, while drawing the line quite arbitrarily at the crucial points. But to the critical intellect it is only obvious that myth is an integral element of all religions and therefore cannot be excluded from the assertions of faith without injuring them. The rupture faith and knowledge is a symptom of the split consciousness which is so characteristic of the mental disorder of our day. It is as if two different persons were making statements LH.UT the same thing, each from his own point of view, or as if one person in two different frames of mind were sketching a picture of his experience. If for again we substitute satiety, it is evident that the latter is suffering from a mental dissituation, i.e. a neurotic disturbance. In view of this, it does not help matters at all if one party pulls obstinately to the right and the other to the left. This is what happens every neurotic psyche, to its own deep distress, and it is just this distress that brings the patient to the analyst. As I stated above in all brevity, while not neglecting to mention certain practical details whose omission might have the reader, the analyst has to establish a relationship with both halves of his patient's personality. Only from them can he put together a whole and complete man, and not merely from one half by suppression of the other half. But this suppression is just what the patient has been doing all along, for the Weltanschauung leaves him with no alternative. His individual situation is the same in principle as the collective situation. He is a Mikrokosm, reflecting on the smallest scale the qualities of society at large. Or conversely, the smallest SEL unit cumulatively perclusing the collective dismission, the latter usability is the more likely one. As the only direct and concrete carrier of life is the individual, while SCWID and the state are conventional ideas and can claim reality only insofar as they are represented by a conglomeration of individuals. Far too little attention has been paid to the fact that, for all our irreligiousness, the distinguishing mark of the Christian, its highest achievement, has become the congenital vice of our age, the supremacy of the Word, of the Logos, which stands for the central figure of our Christian faith. The word has literally become our and so it has remained. Even if we know of Christianity only from hearsay. Words like sciety and state are so concretized that they are almost in the opinion of the man in the street. The state, far more than any king in history, is the inexhaustible giver of all. The state is invoked, made responsible, grumbled at, and so on and so forth. Needy is elevated to the rank of a supreme ethical principle. Indeed, it is even credited with essentially creative capacities. No one seems to notice that this worship of the word, which was necessary at a certain phase of man's mental development, has a perilous shadow side. That is to say, the moment the word, as a result of centuries of education, attains universal validity, it severs its original connection with the divine person. There is then a arsenified church, a state, a key and the word becomes credulity. And the word itself an infernal slogan capable of any deception. With credulity come propaganda and advertising to the citizen with political jobbery and compromises, and the lie reaches proportions never known before in the history of the world. Thus the word, originally announcing the unity of all men and their union in the figure of the one great man, has in our day become a source of suspicion and distrust of all against all. Credulity is one of our worst enemies, but that is the makeshift the neurotic always resorts to in order to quell the doubter in his own breast or to conjure him out of existence. People think you have only to tell that he ought to do thing in order to put him on the right track. But whether he can or will do it is another matter. The psychologist has come to see that nothing is achieved by telling, persuading, admonishing, giving good advice. He must acquaint himself with all the particulars and have an authentic knowledge of the psychic inventory of his patient. He has therefore to relate to the individuality of the sufferer and feel his way into all the crannies of his mind, to a degree that far exceeds the capacity of a teacher or even of a director de conscience. His scientific objectivity, which excludes nothing, enables him to see his patient not only as a human being but also as an anthropid, who is to his like an animal. His training directs his medical interest the conscious personality to the world of unconscious instinct dominated by sexuality and the drive, or self-assertion, which to the twin moral concepts of St. Augustine, concupiscentia and superbia. The clash between these two fundamental instincts, preservation of the species and self-preservation, is the source of numerous conflicts. They are, therefore, the chief object of moral judgment, whose pure excess it is to prevent instinctual collisions as far as possible. As I explained earlier, instinct has two main aspects, on the one hand, that of dynamism and compulsion, and on the other, specific meaning and intention. It is highly probable that all man's psychic functions have an instinctual foundation, as is obviously the case with animals. It is easy to see that in animals instinct functions as the spiritus rector of all behavior. This observation lacks certainty only when the learning capacity begins to develop, for instance in the higher apes and in man. In animals, as a result of their learning capacity, instinct undergoes numerous modifications and differentiations, and in civilized man the instincts are so split up that only a few of the basic ones can be with any certainty in their original form. The most important are the two fundamental instincts already mentioned and their derivatives, and these have been the exclusive concern of medical psychology so far. But in following up the ramifications of instinct, investigators came configurations which could not with certainty be ascribed to either group. To take but one example, the discoverer of the MWER instinct raised the question whether an apparently indubitable expression of the sexual instinct might not be better explained as a power arrangement, and Freud himself felt obliged to acknowledge the existence of ego instincts, in addition to the overriding sexual instinct, a clear concession to the Adlerian standpoint. In view of this, it is hardly surprising that in most cases neurotic symptoms can be explained, almost without contradiction, in terms of either theory. This perplexity does not mean that one or the other standpoint is erroneous or that thr, rather, are relatively valid and, unlike certain one-sided tendencies, admit the existence and common of still other instincts. Although, as I have said, the question of human instinct is a far from simple matter. We shall probably not wrong in assuming that the learning capacity, a quality almost exclusive to man, is based on the instinct for imitation found in animals. It is in the nature of this instinct to disturb other instinctive activities and even to ally to modify them, as can be observed, for instance, in the songs of birds when they adopt other milk slides. Nothing estranges man more from the ground plan of his instincts than his learning capacity, which turns out to be a general genuine drive for progressive transformation of behavior. It more than anything else, is responsible for the altered conditions of his existence and the need for new adaptations which civilization brings. It is also the ultimate source of those numerous psychic disturbances and difficulties which are occasioned by man's progressive alienation from his instinctual foundation, i.e., by his identification with his conscious knowledge of himself, by his concern with consciousness at the expense of the unconscious. The result is that man knows himself only in so far as he can become conscious of himself, a capacity largely dependent on environmental conditions, knowledge and control of which necessitated or suggested certain modifications of his original instinctive tendencies. His consciousness therefore orients itself chiefly by observing and investigating the world around him, and it is to the latter's peculiarities that he must adapt his psychic and technical resources. This task is so exacting, and its fulfillment so profitable, that he forgets himself in the process, losing sight of his instinctual nature and putting his own conception of himself in place of his real being. In this way he slips irreversibly into a purely conceptual world where the of his conscious activity progressively take the place of reality. From his instinctual nature inevitably plunges civilized man into the conflict between conscious and unconscious, spirit and nature, knowledge and faith, a split that comes pathological the moment his consciousness is no longer able to neglect or suppress his instinctual side. The accumulation of individuals who have got into this critical state starts off a mass movement rooting to be the champion of the sup in accordance with the prevailing tendency of consciousness to seek the source of all ills in the outside world. The cry goes up for political and denial changes which, it is said, would automatically solve the much deeper problem of split personality. Hence it is that whenever this demand is fulfilled, political and conditions arise which bring the same ills back again in altered form. What then happens is a simple reversa, the underside comes to the top and the shadow takes the place of the light, and since the former is always anarchic and turbulent, the freedom of the underdog must suffer draconian curtailment. The devil is cast out with all this is unavoidable, because the RCRT of the evil is untouched and merely the counterposition has come to light. The communist revolution has debased man lower than democratic collective psychology has done, because it robs him of his freedom not only in the streal but in the neural and spiritual sphere. Aside from the difficulties, this entailed a great psychological disadvantage for the West that had already made itself unpleasantly felt in the days of German Nazism. We can now a finger at the shadow. He is clearly on the other side of the political frontier, while we are on the side of and enjoy the accession of the right ideals. Did not a well-known statesman recently confess that he had no imagination for evil? In the name of the multitude he was expressing the fact that Western man is in danger of losing his shadow altogether, of identifying himself with his fictive personality and the world with the abstract picture painted by scientific rationalism. His spiritual and moral opponent, who is just as real as he, no longer dwells in his own breast but beyond the geographical line of division, which no longer represents an outward analytical barrier but splits off the conscious from the unconscious man more and more menacingly. Thinking and feeling their inner polarity, and where religious orientation has grown ineffective, not even a god can check the sovereign sway of unleashed psychic functions. Our rational philosophy not bother itself with whether the other person in us, pejoratively derived as the shadow, is in sympathy with our conscious plans and intentions. Evidently it still does not know that we carry in ourselves a real shadow whose existence is grounded in our instinctual nature. No one can either the dynamism or the imagery of the instincts without the gravest injury to himself. Violation or neglect of instinct has painful consequences of a physiological and psychological nature for whose treatment medical help, all, is required. For more than 50 years we have known, or could have known, that there is an unconscious counterbalance to con. Medical psychology has furnished all the necessary empirical and experimental proofs of this. There is an unconscious psychic reality which demonstrably influences consciousness and its contents. All this is known, but no practical conclusions have been drawn from this fact. We still go on thinking and acting as before, as if we were simplex and not duplex. Accordingly, we imagine ourselves to be innocuous, reasonable, and humane. We do not think of distrusting our motives or of asking ourselves how the inner man feels about the things we do in the outside world. But actually it is frivolous, superficial, and unreasonable of us, as well as psychically unhygienic, to overlook the reaction and standpoint of the unconscious. Since words written, the shadow has followed up this overbright pie. With charge of light to so it can regard one's stomach or heart as unimportant and worthy of contempt, but that does not prevent overeating or overexertion from having consequences that affect the whole man. Yet we think that psychic mistakes and their consequences can be got rid of with mere words, for psychic means less than air to most all the same. Miley can deny that without the Ihashe there would be no world at all, and still less a human world. Virtually everything depends on the human psyche and its functions. It should be worthy of all the attention we can give it, especially when everyone admits that the wheel or of the future will be decided neither by the threat of wild animals, nor by natural catastrophes, nor by the danger of worldwide epidemics, but simply and solely by the psychic changes in man. It needs only an almost imperceptible disturbance of equilibrium in a few of our rulers' heads to plunge the world into fire and radioactivity. The technical means necessary for this are present on both sides. And certain consciences, uncontrolled by any inner opponent, can be put into effect all easily, as we have seen already from the example of one. The consciousness of modern man still clings so much to external objects that he makes them exclusively responsible, as if it were on them that the decision depended. That the psychic state of certain individuals could ever emancipate itself from the behavior of objects is something that is considered far too little, although irrationalities of this sort are observed every day and can happen to everyone. The forlorn state of consciousness in our world is due primarily to of instinct, and the reason for this lies in the development of the human mind over the past eon. The more man had over nature, the more his knowledge and skill went to his head, and the dearer became his contempt for the merely natural and accidental, for all irrational data including the objective, which is everything that consciousness is not. In contrast to the subjectivism of the conscious mind, the unconscious is objective, manifesting itself mainly in the form of contrary feelings, fantasies, emotions, impulses, and dreams, none of which one makes oneself but which come up one objectively. Even today psychology is still, for the most part, the science of conscious contents, measured as far as possible by collective standards. The individual psyche has come a mere accident, a marginal phenomenon, while the unconscious, which can manifest itself only in the real, irrationally given, human, has been ignored altogether. This was not the result of carelessness or of lack of knowledge, but of downright resistance to the mere possibility that there could be a second archaic authority besides the ego. RT seems a sensitive menace to the ego that its monarchy could be doubted. The religious, on the other hand, is accustomed to the thought of not sole master in his own house. He believes that and not he himself decides in the end. But how many of us would dare to let the will of God decide, and which of us would not feel embarrassed if he had to say how far the decision came from himself? The religious person, so far as one can judge, is directly influenced by the reaction of the unconscious. As a rule, he calls this the operation of conscience. But since the same psychic background produces reactions other than moral ones, point to the lever as measuring his conscience by the traditional ethical standard and thus by a collective value, in which endeavor he is assiduously rooted by his church, long as the individual can hold fast to his traditional beliefs. and the circumstances of his time do not demand stronger emphasis on individual autonomy, he can rest content with the situation. But the situation is radically altered when the worldly-minded man who is oriented to external factors and has lost his religious beliefs appears en masse. As is the case, he is then forced onto the defensive and must catechise himself on the foundation of his beliefs. He is no longer sustained by the tremendous suggestive of the consensus omnium and is keenly aware of the weakening of the Church and the precariousness of its dogmatic assumptions. To counter this, the Church recommends more faith, as if this gift of grace on man's goodwill and pleasure. The seat of faith, however, is not consciousness but spontaneous religious, which brings the individual's faith into immediate relation with God. Here each of us must ask, have I any religious experience in immediate relation to and hence that certainty which will keep me, as an individual, from dissolving in the crowd? Cf. A Psychological View of CWPAR 6. Self-knowledge. To this question there is a elucidative answer only when the individual is willing to fulfill the demands of rigorous self-examination, and if he does this, he will not only discover some redant truths himself but will also have gained a psychological advantage. He will have succeeded in deeming himself worthy of serious attention and sympathetic interest. He will have set his hand, as it were, to a deceleration of his own human dignity and taken the first step towards the foundations of his consciousness, that is, towards the unconscious, the only available source of religious experience. This is certainly not to say that what we call the unconscious is identical with God or is set up in his place. It is simply the medium from which religious seems to flow. As to what the further cause of such accelerance may be, the answer to this lies beyond the range of human knowledge. Knowledge of God is a transcendental problem. The religious person enjoys a great advantage when it comes to answering the crucial question that hangs over our time like a threat. He has a clear idea of the way his subjective existence is grounded in his relation to God. Put the word God in quotes in order to indicate that we are dealing with an anthropomorphic idea whose dynamism and SYMLism are filtered through the medium of the unconscious psyche. Anyone who wants to can at least draw near to the source of such experiences, no matter whether he believes in or not. Without this approach it is only in rare cases that we witness those miraculous conversions of which Paul's Damascus CX Fecrans is the prototype. That religious experiences exist no longer needs PRCXF. But it will always remain doubtful whether what metaphysics and theology call Axel and the gods is the real ground of these experiences. The question is idle, actually, and answers itself by reaction of the subjectively overwhelming numinosity of civil.ation in transition. The anyone who has had it is seized by it and there. For not innate to indulge in fruitless metaphysical or epistemological speculations, absolute certainty brings its own evidence and has no need of anthropomorphic pre-XFS. In view of the general ignorance of and bias against psychology, it must be accounted a misfortune that the one experience which makes sense of individual existence should seem to have its origin in a medium that is certain to catch everybody's prejudices. Once more the doubt is heard, what can come out of Nazareth? The unconscious, if not regarded outright as a sort of refuse bin underneath the conscious mind, is at any rate supposed to have merely animal nature. In reality, however, and by definition it is of uncertain extent and constitution, so that overvaluation or undervaluation of it is pointless and can be dismissed as mere prejudice. At all events, such judgments sound very queer in the mouths of Christians, whose Lord was himself born on the straw of a stable, among the domestic animals. It would have been more to the taste of the multitude if he had got himself in a temple. In the same way, the worldly-minded mass man looks for the numinous experience in the mass meeting, which provides an infinitely more impasing background than the individual soul. Even church Christians share this pernicious delusion. Psychology's insistence on the redance of unconscious processes for religious experience is extremely unpopular, no less with the identical right than with the left. For the former the deciding factor is the historical revelation that came to man from outside. To the latter this is sheer nonsense, and man has no religious function at all, except in the party doctrine, when suddenly the most intense faith is called for. On top of this, the various creeds assert quite different things. and each of them claims to the absolute truth. Yet today we live in a unitary world where distances are reckoned by hours and no longer by weeks and months. Exotic races have ceased to accept shows in ethnological museums. They have become our neighbors, and what was yesterday the private concern of the ethnologist is today a social and psychological problem. Already the ideological spheres take into touch, to enter, penetrate, and the time may not far off when the question of mutual understanding will acute. To make oneself understand MXL is certainly without far-reaching comprehension of the other's standpoint. The insight needed for this will have repercussions on both sides. History will undoubtedly pass over those who feel it is their Vixati zero and to resist this inevitable development, however desirable and psychologically it may to cling to what is essential and good in our own tradition. Despite all the differences, the unity of mankind will assert itself irresistibly. On this card Marxist doctrine has staked its life, while the West hopes to achieve its aim with technology and economic aid. Communism has not the enormous importance of the ideological element and the universality of basic principles. The colored races share our ideological weakness and in this are just as vulnerable as we are. The underestimation of the psychological factor is likely to take a bitter revenge. It is therefore high time we caught up with ourselves in this matter. For the present this must remain a pious wish. Self-knowledge, as well as being highly unpolar, seems to an unpleasantly idealistic goal, reeks of morality, and is preoccupied with the psychological shadow, which is normally denied whenever insensible or at least not spoken of. The task that faces our age is indeed almost insufferably difficult. It makes the highest demands on our responsibility if we are not to be guilty of another treason to clerks. It addresses itself to those leading and influential personalities who have the necessary intelligence to understand the situation our world is in. One might ask them to consult their consciences. But since it is a matter not only of intellectual understanding but of moral conclusions, there is unfortunately no cause for optimism. Nature, as we know, is not so lavish with her that she joins to a high intelligence the gifts of the heart also. As a rule, where one is present the other is missing, and where one capacity is present in perfection it is generally at the of all the others. The discrepancy intellect and feeling, which get in each other's way at the best of times, is a particularly painful chapter in the history of the human psyche. There is no sense in formulating the task that our age has forced us as a moral demand. We can, at best, merely make the ecological world situation so clear that it can seen even by the myopic, and give utterance to words and ideas which even the hard of hearing can hear. We may hope for men of understanding and men of go-XL will, and must therefore not grow weary of reiterating those thoughts and insights which are needed. Finally, even the truth can spread and not only the lie. With these words I should like to draw the reader's attention to the main difficulty he has to face. The horror which the dictator states have of late brought mankind is nothing less than the culmination of all those atrocities of which our ancestors made themselves guilty in the not-so-distant past. Quite apart from the barbarities and bloodbaths perpetrated by the Christian nations among themselves throughout European history, the European has also to answer for all the crimes he has committed against the colored races during the process of colonization. In this respect the white man carries a very heavy burden indeed. It shows us a picture of the common human shadow that could hardly be in blacker colors. The evil that comes to light in man and that undoubtedly dwells within him is of gigantic proportions, so that for the Church to talk of original sin and to trace it back to Adam's relatively innocent slip-up with Eve is almost a euphemism. The case is far graver and is grossly underestimated. Since it is universally believed that man is merely what his consciousness knows of itself, he regards himself as harmless and so adds stupidity to iniquity. He does not deny that terrible things have happened and still go on happening, but it is always the others who do them. And when such deeds belong to the recent or remote past, they quickly and conveniently sink into the sea of forgetfulness, and that state of chronic wagily-mindedness returns which we describe as normality. In shocking contrast to this is the fact that nothing has finally disappeared and nothing has been made good. The evil, the guilt, the profound unease of conscience, the dark cling, are there before our eyes, if only we would see. Man has done these things. I am a man, who has his share of human nature, therefore I am guilty with the rest and bear unaltered and indelibly within me the calyx one city and the inclination to do them again at any time. Even if, juristically speaking, we were not accessories to the crime, we are always, thanks to our human nature, potential criminals. In reality we merely lacked a suitable opportunity to be drawn into the infernal melee. None of us stands outside humanity's black collective shadow. Whether the crime occurred many generations back or hap *ns it remains the symptom of a disposition that is always and everywhere present, and one would therefore do well to emiss some imagination for evil, for only the FCX-I can permanently disregard the conditions of his own nature. In fact, this negligence is the best means of making him an instrument of evil. Harmlessness and naivete are as little helpful as it would be for a cholera patient and those in his vicinity to remain unconscious of the contagiousness of the disease. On the contrary, they lead to projection of the unrecognized evil into the other. This strengthens the opponent's scission in the most effective way, because the projection carries the fear which we involuntarily and secretly feel for our own evil over to the other side and considerably increases the formidableness of his threat. What is even worse, our lack of insight deprives us of the capacity to deal with evil. Here, we come up against one of the main prejudices of the Christian tradition, and one that is a great stumbling block to our policies. We should, so we are told, eschew evil and, if possible, neither touch nor mention it. For evil is also the thing of ill omen, that which is taboored and feared. This attitude towards evil, and the apparent circumventing of it, flatter the primitive tendency in us to shut our eyes to evil and drive it over some frontier or other, like the Old Testament scapegoat, which was to carry the evil into the wilderness. But if one can no longer avoid the realization that evil, without man's ever having chosen it, is in human nature itself, then it best rides the psychological stage as the equal and opposite partner of good. This realization leads straight to a psychological dualism, already unconsciously prefigured in the world and in the even more unconscious Nuslern man himself. The dualism not come from this realization, rather, we are in a split condition to targin with. It would be an insufferable thought that we had to take responsibility for so much guiltiness. We therefore prefer to localize the evil in individual criminals or groups of criminals, while washing our hands in innocence and ignoring the general proclivity to evil. This sanctimoniousness cannot kept up in the long run, because the evil, as shows, lies in man unless, in accordance with the Christian view, one is willing to articulate a metaphysical principle of evil. The great advantage of this view is that it exonerates man's conscience of heavy irresponsibility and foists it off on the devil, in correct psychological appreciation of the fact that man is much more the victim of his psychic constitution than its inventor. Considering that the evil of our day puts everything that has ever agonized mankind in the DXST shade, one must ask oneself how it is that, for all our progress in the administration of justice, in medicine, and in technology, for all our concern with life and health, monstrous engines of destruction have invented which could easily exterminate the human race. No one will maintain that the atomic physicists are a pack of criminals because it is to their efforts that we owe that peculiar flower of human ingenuity, the hydrogen bomb. The vast amount of intellectual work that went into the development of nuclear physics was put forth by men who dedicated themselves to their task with the greatest exertion and self-sacrifice, and whose moral achievement could therefore just as easily have earned them the merit of inventing something useful and beneficial to humanity. But even though the first step along the road to a momentous invention may be the outcome of a conscious decision, here, as everywhere, the idea, the hunch or intuition plays an important part. In other words, the unconscious collaborates and often makes decisive contributions. So it is not the conscious effort alone that is responsible for the result. Somewhere or other the unconscious, with its barely discernible goals and intentions, has its finger in the pie. If it puts a weapon in your hand, it is aiming at some kind of violence. Knowledge of the truth is the foremost goal of science, and if in pursuit of the longing for light we stumble upon an immense danger, then one has the impression more of fatality than of it is not that present-day man is capable of greater evil than the man of antiquity or the primitive. He merely has incomparably more effective means with which to realize his to evil. As his consciousness has broadened and differentiated, so his moral nature has lagged behind. That is the great problem before us Tkele. Reason alone no longer suffices. In theory, it lies within the FXWER of reason to desist from experiments of such hellish as nuclear fission if only cause of their dangerousness. But fear of the evil which one not see in on's own bosom but always in else's checks reason every time, although everyone knows that the use of this weapon means the certain end of our present human world. The fear of universal destruction may spare us the worst, yet the insensibility of it will nevertheless hang over us like a dark cloud so long as no bridge is found across the worldwide psychic and political split. A bridge as certain as the existence of the hydrogen if only a worldwide consciousness could arise that all division and all fission are due to the splitting of opposites in the psyche. Then we should know where to target. But if even the smallest and most arsenal stirrings of the individual ebach so insignificant in themselves remain as unconscious and unrecognized as they have hitherto, they will go on accumulating in perexless mass groupings and mass movements which cannot subjected to reasonable control or manipulated to a grxd end. All direct efforts to do so are no more than shadow the infatuated by illusion traying the gladiators themselves. The crux the matter is man's own dualism, to which he knows no answer. This abyss has suddenly yawned before him with the latest events in world history. After mankind had lived for many centuries in the comfortable belief that a unitary had created man in his own image. As a little unity. Even Chkleropol are largely unconscious of the fact that every individual is a cell in the structure of various international organisms and is therefore causally implicated in their conflicts. He knows that as an individual being he is more or less meaningless and feels himself the victim of uncontrollable forces, but, on the other hand, he harbors within himself a dangerous shadow and adversary who is involved as an invisible helper in the dark machinations of the political monster. It is in the nature of always to see the evil in the opposite group, just as the individual has an ineradicable tendency to get rid of everything he does not know and does not want to know himself by foisting it off on some sly else. Nothing has a more divisive and alienating effect than this moral complacency and lack of responsibility, and nothing promotes understanding and rapprochement more than the mutual withdrawal of projections. This necessary corrective demands self-criticism, for one cannot just tell the other efferson to withdraw them. He does not recognize them for what they are any more than one does oneself. We can recognize our prejudices and illusions only when, from a broader psychological knowledge of ourselves and others, we are prepared to doubt the absolute rightness of our assumptions and compare them carefully and conscientiously with the objective facts. Funnily enough, self-criticism is an idea much in vogue in Marxist countries, but there it is subordinated to ideological considerations and must serve the state, and not truth and justice in men's dealings with one another. The mass state has no intention of promoting mutual understanding and the relationship of man to man. It strives, rather, for atomization, for the psychic isolation of the individual. The more unrelated individuals are, the more the state and vice. There can be no doubt that in the democracies the distance between man and man is much greater than is conducive to public welfare, let alone to our psychic needs. True, all sorts of attempts are made to level out glaring societal contrasts by appealing to people's idealism, enthusiasm, and ethical conscience, but, characteristically, one forgets to apply the necessary self-criticism, to answer the question, who is making the idealistic demand? Is it, perchance, someone who jumps over his own shadow in order to hurl himself avidly on some idealistic program that offers him a welcome alibi? How much respectability and apparent morality is there, cloaking in deceptive colors a very different inner world of darkness? One would first like to assure that the man who talks of ideals is himself ideal, so that his words and deeds are more than they seem to be. Ideal is and remains there. For an unfulfilled, since we usually have keen noses in this respect, most of the idealisms that are preached and paraded us sound rather hollow and come acceptable only when their opposite is also ornely admitted. Without this counterweight, the ideal exceeds our human capacity, becomes incredible because of its humorlessness, and degenerates into bluff, albeit a well-meant one. Bluff is an illegitimate way of overexerting and suppressing others and leads to no recognition of the shadow. On the other hand, leads to the mxlsty we need in order to acknowledge imperfection. And it is just this conscious recognition and consideration that are needed whenever a human relationship is to be established. A human relationship is not based on differentiation and imperfection, for these only emphasize the differences ot call forth the exact omx. It is based, rather, on what is weak, helpless, and in need of very ground and motive for devrendance. The perfect have no need of others, but weakness has, for it seeks supplix rt and does not confront its partner with anything that might force him into an inferior position and even humiliate him. This humiliation may happen only easily when high idealism plays prominent a role. Reflections of this kind should not taken as superfluous sentimentalities. The question of human relationship and of the inner cohesion of our society is an urgent one in view of the atomization of the pent-up mass man, whose one relationships are undermined by general mistrust. Wherever justice is uncertain and spying and terror are at work, human beings fall into isolation, which, of course, is the aim and purpose of the dictator state, since it is based on the greatest possible accumulation of depoentiated social units. To counter this danger, the free wiety needs a bond of an effective nature, a principle of a kind like caritas, the Christian love of your neighbor. But it is just this love for one's fellow man that suffers most of all from the lack of understanding wrought by Project Lion. It would therefore be very much in the interest of the free society to give some thought to the question of human relationship from the psychological into view, for in this resides its real cohesion and consequently its strength. Where love stops, LWER legends, and violence, and terror. These reflections are not intended as into idealism, but only to promote a consciousness of the psychological situation. I do not know which is weaker, the idealism or the insight of the public. I only know that it needs time to bring about psychic changes that have any prospect of enduring. Insight that dawns slowly seems to me to have more lasting effects than a fitful idealism, which is unlikely to hold out for long. 7. The meaning of self-knowledge. What our age thinks of as the shadow and inferior part of the psyche contains more than something merely negative. The very fact that through self-knowledge, that is, by exploring our own souls, we come the instincts and their world of imagery should throw some light on the beware slumton ring in the psyche, of which we are seldom aware so long as all well. They are of the greatest dynamism, and it entirely on the preparedness and attitude of the conscience mind whether the eruption of these forces, and the images and ideas associated with them, will tend towards construction or catastrophe. The psychologist seems to be the only son who knows from experience how precarious the psychic preparedness of RNCX learned man is. For he is the only one who sees himself to seek out in man's own nature those help. Full FX wares and ideas which over and over have enabled him to find the right way through darkness and danger. For this exact work the psychologist requires all his patience. He may not rely on any traditional oughts and musts, leaving the other person to make all the effort and contenting himself with the easy role of advisor and admonisher. Everyone knows the futility of preaching about things that are desirable, yet the general helplessness in this situation is so great, and the need so dire, that one prefers to repeat the old mistake instead of racking one's brains over a subjective problem. Besides, it is always a question of one single individual only and not 10,000. When the trouble one takes would ostensibly have more impressive results, though one knows well enough that nothing has happened net at all unless the individual changes. The effect on all individuals, which one would like to see realized, may not set in for hundreds of years, for the spiritual transformation of mankind follows the slow tread of the centuries and cannot tx hurried or held up by any rational process of reflection, let alone brought to fruition in one generation. what lie within our reach. However, is the change in individuals who have, or create for themselves, an opportunity to influence others of like mind. I do not mean by persuading or preaching I am thinking, rather, of the well-known fact that anyone who has insight into his own actions, and has thus found access to the unconscious, involuntarily exercises an influence on his environment. The deepening and broadening of his consciousness produces the kind of effect which the primitives call mana. It is an unintentional influence on the unconscious of others, a sort of unconscious prestige. And its effect lasts only so long as it is not by conscious intention. Nor is the striving for self-knowledge altogether without irrcs of success, since there exists a factor which, though completely disregarded, meets our expectations halfway. This is the unconscious zeitgeist. It compensates the attitude of the conscious mind and anticipates changes to come. An excellent example of this is learn art. Though seeming to deal with aesthetic problems, it is really performing a work of education on the public by breaking down and destroying their previous aesthetic views of what is irradical in form and meaningful in content. The pleasingness of the artistic PR sluct is replaced by chill abstractions of the most subjective nature which brusquely slam thee on the naive and romantic delight in the senses and on the obligatory love for the object. This tells us, in plain and universal language, that the prophetic spirit of art has turned away from the old object relationship towards the for the time being dark chaos of subjectivisms. Certainly art, so far as we can judge of it, has not yet discovered in this darkness what it is that could hold all men together and give expression to their psychic wholeness. Since reflection seems to be needed for this, it may thought such are reserved for other fields of endeavor. Great art till now has always derived its fruitfulness from myth, from the unconscious process of symbolization which continues through the ages and, as the primordial manifestation of the human spirit, will continue to be the of all creation in the future. The development of modern art with its seemingly nihilistic trend towards disintegration must understood as the symptom and one of a RNCXXL of universal destruction and renewal that has set its mark on our age. This makes itself felt everywhere, politically, socially, and philosophically. We are living in what the Greeks called the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles, and this peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not of our conscious, is the expression of the unconscious man within us who is changing. Coming generations will have to take account of this momentum transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself through the might of its own technology and science. As at the beginning of the Christian era, so again today we are HCED with the problem of the general moral backwardness which has failed to keep pace with our scientific, technical, and scryal progress. So much is at stake and so much turns on the psychological constitution of Undiscovered man. Is he capable of resisting the temptation to use his FHWER for the purpose of staging a world conflagration? Is he conscious 01, the path he is treading, and what the conclusions are that must be drawn from the present world situation and his own psychic situation? Does he know that he is on the imminent of losing the life-preserving myth of the inner man which Christianity has treasured up for him? He realize what lies in store should this catastrophe ever befall him? Is he even capable of realizing that this would in fact be a catastrophe? And finally, does the individual know that he is the make-weight that the scales? Happiness and contentment, equability of mind and meaningfulness of life, these can be experienced only by the individual and not by a state, which, on the one hand, is nothing but a convention agreed to by independent individuals and, on the other, continually threatens to paralyze and suppress the individual. The psychiatrist is one of those who know most about the conditions of TFI soul's welfare, upon which so finitely much in the s.zile sum. The social and circumstances of the time are certainly of considerable significance, but their irritance for the weal or woe of the individual has been boundlessly overestimated in so far as they are taken for the sole deciding factors. In this respect all our social goals commit the error of overlooking the psychology of the person for whom they are intended and very often of promoting only his illusions. I hope, therefore, that a psychiatrist, who in the course of a long life has devoted himself to the causes and consequences of disorders, may be to express his opinion, in all the Ruslesti enjoined of Xen him as an individual, about the questions raised by the world situation today, am neither spurred on by excessive optimism nor in love with high ideals, but am merely concerned with the fate of the individual man, infinitesimal unit on whom a world depends. And in whom, if we read the meaning of the Christian message aright, even seeks his goal. 11 Symbols and the interpretation of dreams. The significance of dreams. Through his language, man tries to designate things in such a way that his words will convey the meaning of what he intends to communicate. But sometimes he uses terms or images that are not strictly descriptive and can be understood only under certain conditions. Take, for instance, the many abbreviations like UN, UNEX.O, NATO, etc., which infest our newspapers, or trademarks or the names of patent medicines. Although one cannot see what they mean, they yet have a definite meaning if you know it. Such designations are not symbols, they are signs. What we call a SYMTX.L is a term, a name, or an image which in itself may be familiar to us, but its connotations, use, and application are specific or peculiar and hint at a hidden, vague, or unknown meaning. Take as an example the image of the double adze that occurs frequently on Cretan monuments. We know the object, but we do not know its specific meaning. Again, a Hindu who had been on a visit to England told his friends at home that the English animals, because he had found eagles, lions, and oxen in their old churches and cathedrals, and he was not aware that these animals were the symbols of the evangelists. There are even many Christians who do not know that they are derived from the vision of Ezekiel, which in turn offers a parallel to the Egyptian Horus and his 4 sons. Other examples are the wheel and the cross, which are universally known objects, yet under certain conditions they are and mean something that is still a matter for controversial speculation. A term or image is symbolic when it means more than it denotes or expresses. It has a wider unconscious aspect, an aspect that can never be precisely defined or fully explained. This peculiarity is due to the fact that, in exploring the symbol, the mind is finally led towards ideas of a transcendent nature, where reason must capitulate. The wheel, for instance, may lead our thoughts to the idea of a divine son, but at this point reason has to admit its inadequacy, for we are unable to define or to establish the existence of a divine being. We are merely human, and our intellectual resources are correspondingly limited. We may call something divine, but this is simply a name, a favonda based per haf asterisk on a creed, yet never amounting to a proof. Because there are innumerable things beyond the range of human understanding, we constantly use symbolic expressions and images when referring to them. Ecclesiastical language in particular is full of, but this conscious use of symbolicism is only one aspect of a psychological fact of great importance. We also symbols unconsciously and spontaneously in our dreams. Each act of amorspion, or cognition, accomplishes its task only partially, it is never complete. First of all, sense-perception, fundamental to all experience, is restricted by the limited number and quality of our senses, which can however be compensated to a certain extent by the use of instruments, but not sufficiently to eliminate entirely a fringe of uncertainty. Moreover, amorception translates the observed fact into a seemingly incommensurable medium, into a psychic event, the nature of which is unknowable. Unknowable, because cognition cannot cognize itself, the psyche cannot know its own psychic substance. There is thus an indefinite number of unknown factors in every experience, in addition to which the object of cognition is always unknown in certain resorts, since we cannot know the ultimate nature of matter itself. Every conscious act or event thus has an unconscious aspect, just as every sense perception has a subliminal aspect, for instance, sound below or audibility, or light below or ALX, ve visibility. The unconscious part of a psychic event reaches consciousness only indirectly, if at all. The event reveals the existence of its unconscious inasmuch as it is characterized either by emotionality or by a vital that has not been realized consciously. The unconscious part is a sort of afterthought, which may become conscious in the course of time by means of intuition or by deeper reflection. but the event can also manifest its unconscious as FT, and this is usually the case in a dream. The dream shows this ASFCT in the form of a symbolic image and not as a rational thought. It was the understanding of dreams that first enabled us to investigate the unconscious ASPT of conscious psychic events and to discover its nature. It has taken the human mind a long time to arrive at a more or less rational and scientific understanding of the functional meaning of dreams. Freud was the first who tried to elucidate the unconscious ground of consciousness in an empirical way. He worked on the general assumption that dream contents are related to conscious representations through the law of association, i.e., by causal dependence, and are not merely chance occurrences. This assumption is by no means arbitrary but is based on the empirical fact, observed long ago by neurologists and especially by Pierre Janet, that neurotic symptoms are connected with some conscious. They even appear to split off areas of the conscious mind which, at another time and under different conditions, can conscious. Just as an hysterical anesthesia can be there one moment and gone the next, only to reappear again after a while. Breuer and Freud more than half a century ago that neurotic symptoms are meaningful and make sense inasmuch as they express a certain thought. In other words, they function in the same manner as dreams, they symbolize. A patient, for instance, confronted with an intolerable situation, develops a spasm whenever he tries to swallow, he can't swallow it. Under similar conditions another patient develops asthma, he can't breathe the atmosphere at home. A third suffers from a peculiar paralysis of the legs, he can't go on any more. A fourth vomits everything he eats, he can't stomach it. And so on. They could all just as well have had dreams of a similar kind. Dreams, of course, display a greater variety and are often full of picturesque and luxuriant fantasy. But they down eventually to the same basic thought if one follows Freud's original method of free association. This method, and one consists in letting the patient go on talking about his dream images. That is precisely what the non-psychological detour omits to do. Being always pressed for time, he loathes letting his patient babble on his fantasies seemingly without end. Yet, if he only knew, his patient is just about to give himself away and to reveal the unconscious of his ailment. Anyone who talks long enough will inevitably betray himself by what he says and what he purposely refrains from saying. He may try very hard to lead the gster and himself away from the real facts, but after a while it is quite easy to see which he is trying to steer away from. Through apparently rambling and irrational talk, he unconsciously circumscribes a certain area to which he continually returns in ever-renewed attempts to hide it. In his circumlocutions he even makes use of a slow deal of symbolism, apparently serving his purpose of hiding and avoiding yet pointing all the time to the core of his predicament. Thus, if the dictator is patient enough, he will hear a wealth of SYMLX-lick talk, seemingly calculated to hide something. A secret, from conscious realization. A detour sees so many things from the seamy side of life that he is seldom far from the truth when he interprets the hints which his patient is emitting as signs of an uneasy conscience. What he eventually discovers, unfortunately, confirms his XF** irritations. Thus far can say anything against Freud's theory of repression and wish fulfillment as apparent causes of dream symbolism. If one considers the following, however, one comes skeptical. A friend and colleague of mine, traveling for long hours on a train journey through Russia, passed the time by trying to decipher the Cyrillic script of the railway notices in his compartment. He fell into a sort of reverie what the letters might mean, and following the principle of free ask wi they reminded him of. And he found himself in the midst of all sorts of reminiscences. Among them, to his great displeasure, he did not fail to discover those old and disagreeable companions of sleepless nights. His complexes repressed and carefully avoided topics which the dster would joyously to as the most likely causes of a neurosis or the most convincing meaning of a dream. There was no dream, however, merely free associations to incomprehensible letters. Which means that from any fxint of the compass you can reach the center directly. Through free association you arrive at the critical secret thoughts, no matter where you start from, be it symptoms, trance, fantasies, Cyrillic letters, or examples of modern art. At all events, this fact proves nothing with regard to dreams and their real meaning. It only shows the existence of assayable material floating about. Very often dreams have a very definite, as if purposeful, structure, indicating the underlying thought or intention, though, as a rule, the latter is not immediately comprehensible. This experience was an eye-warner to me, and, without dismissing the idea of a Sarayatution altogether, I thought one should pay more attention to the dream itself, i.e., to its actual form and statement. For instance, a patient of mine dreamed cf. A drunken, disheveled, vulgar woman called his wife, though in reality his wife was totally different. The dream statement, therefore, is shocking and utterly unlike reality, yet that is what the dream says. Naturally, such a statement is not acceptable and is immediately dismissed as dream nonsense. If you let the patient ascribe freely to the dream, he will most likely try to get away as far as possible from such a shocking thought in order to end up with one of his staple complexes, but you will have learned nothing about the meaning of this particular dream. What is the unconscious trying to convey by such an obviously untrue statement? If somebody with little experience in knowledge dreams should think that dreams are just chaotic, occurrences without meaning, he is it to do so. But if one assumes that they are normal events, which as a matter of fact they are, one is bound to consider that they are either causal, i.e., that there is a rational cause for their existence, or in some way purposive, or both, in other words, that they make sense. Clearly, the dream is seeking to express the idea of a degenerate female who is closely connected with the dreamer. This idea is projected upon his wife, where the statement becomes untrue. What does it refer to, then? Subtler minds in the Middle Ages already knew that every man carries Eve, his wife, hidden in his body. It is this feminine element in every man, based on the minority of female genes in his biological makeup, which I have called the anima. She consists essentially in a certain inferior kind of relatedness to the surroundings and particularly to women, which is kept carefully concealed from others as well as from oneself. A man's visible personality may seem quite normal, while his anima side is sometimes in a deplorable state. This was the case with our dreamer. His female side was not nice. Applied to his anima, the dream statement hits the nail on the head when it says, "You are like a degenerate female." It hits him hard, as indeed it should. One should not, however, understand such a dream as evidence for the moral nature of the unconscious. It is merely an attempt to balance the lopsidedness of the conscious mind, which had the fiction that one was a perfect gentleman throughout. Such experiences taught me to mistrust free assayatution. I no longer followed associations that led far afield and away from the manifest dream statement. I concentrated rather on the actual dream text as the thing which was intended by the Uncan, and I began to circumambulate the dream itself, never letting it out of my sight, or as one turns an unknown object round and round in one's hands to absorb every detail of it. But why should one consider dreams, those flimsy, elusive, unreliable, vague, and uncertain phantasms, at all? Are they worthy of our attention? Our rationalism would certainly not recommend them, and the history of dream interpretation for Freud was a sore accent anyway, most discouraging in fact, most unscientific to say the least. Yet dreams are the commonest and universally accessible source for the investigation of man's symbolizing faculty, apart from the contents of neuroses, myths, and of the various arts. All these, however, are more complicated and more difficult to understand because, when it comes to the question of their individual nature, one cannot venture to interpret such unconscious acts without the aid of the originator. Dreams are indeed the chief source of all our knowledge about symbolism. One cannot invent wherever they occur. They have not been devised by conscious intention and willful selection, because, if such a doer had used, they would have been nothing but signs and abbreviations of conscious thoughts. Symbols to us spontaneously, as one can see in our dreams, which are not invented but which happen to us. They are not immediately understandable, they need careful analysis by means of association, but, as have said, not of, free association, which we know always leads back eventually to the emotional thoughts or complexes that are unconsciously captivating our mind. To get there, we have no need of dreams. But in the early days of medical psychology, the general assumption was that dreams were analyzed for the purpose of discovering complexes. For this purpose, however, it is sufficient to conduct an association test, which supplies all the necessary hints as I have shown long ago. And not even this test is necessary, because one can obtain the same result by letting talk long enough. There can be no doubt that dreams often arise from an emotional disturbance in which the habitual complexes are involved. The habitual complexes are the tender of the psyche, which react most quickly to a problematical external situation. But I began to suspect that dreams might have another, more interesting function. The fact that they eventually lead back to the complexes is not the specific merit of dreams. If we want to learn what a dream means and what specific function it fulfills, we must disregard its inevitable outcome, the complex. We must put a check on limitless free association, a restriction provided by the dream itself. By FR association, we move away 0m the individual dream image and lose sight of it. We must, on the contrary, keep close to the dream and its individual form. The dream is its own limitation. It is itself the criterion of what to it and of what leads away from it. All material that DC*S not lie within the SCOFN of the dream, or that oversteps the TM boundaries set by its individual form, leads astray and produces nothing but the complexes, and we do not know whether they to the dream or not, since they can in so many other ways. There is, for instance, an almost infinite variety of images by which the sexual act can be symbolized, or rather allegorized. But the dream obviously intends its own specific expression in spite of the fact that the resultant will lead to the idea of sexual intercourse. This is no news and is easy to see. But the real task is to understand why the dream has chosen its own individual expression. Only the material that is clearly and visibly indicated as belonging to the dream by the dream images themselves should be used for interpretation. While free association moves away from the theme of the dream in mething like a zigzag line, the new myth slow, as I have always said, is more like a circumambulation, the center of which is the dream image. One concentrates on the specific topics, on the dream itself, and disregards the frequent attempts of the dreamer to break away from it. This ever-present neurotic dissociative tendency has many aspects, but at bottom it seems to consist in a basic resistance of the conscious mind to anything unconscious and unknown. As we know, this often fierce resistance is typical of the psychology primitive anxieties, which are as a rule conservative and show pronounced misoneistic tendencies. Anything new and unknown causes distinct and even fear. The primitive manifests all the reactions of a wild animal to untoward events. Our highly differentiated civilization is not at all free from such primitive behavior. A new idea that is not exactly in line with general expectations meets with the severest obstacles of a psychological kind. It is given no lit, but is feared, batted, and hoard in every way. Many pioneers can tell a story of misery, all due to the primitive misoneism of their contemporaries. When it comes to psychology, one of the youngest of the sciences, you can see misoneism at work, and in dealing with your own dreams you can easily observe your reactions when you have to admit a disagreeable thought. It is chiefly an all fear of the unexpected and unknown that makes eager to use free association as a means of escape. I do not know how many times in my professional work have had to repeat the words, "Now let's get back to your dream." What does the dream say? If one wants to understand a dream, it must be taken seriously, and one must also assume that it means what it manifestly says, since there is no valid reason to suppose that it is anything other than it is. Yet the apparent futility of dreams is so overwhelming that not only the dreamer but the interpreter as well may easily succumb to the prejudice of the nothing but explanation. Whenever a dream gets difficult and obstinate, the temptation to dismiss it altogether is not far away. When I was doing field work with a primitive in East Africa, I discovered to my amazement that they denied having dreams at all. but by patient indirect talk I found that they had dreams all right, like else, but were convinced that their dreams meant nothing. Dreams of ordinary men mean nothing, they said. The only dreams that mattered were those of the chief and the medicine man, which concerned the welfare of the tribe. Such dreams were highly appreciated. The only drawback was that the chief as well as the medicine man denied having any more dreams, since the British were in the country. The district commissioner had taken over the function of the big dream. This incident shows that even in a primitive society dreams are ambivalent, just as in our society, where most people see nothing in dreams while a minority thinks very highly of them. The Church, for instance, has long known of somnia deo missa, dreams sent by God, and in our own time we have watched the growth of a scientific discipline which aims at exploring the vast field of unconscious processes. Yet the average man thinks little or nothing dreams, and even a thoroughly educated person shares the common ignorance and underrates everything remotely connected with the unconscious. The very existence of an unconscious psyche is denied by a great number of scientists and philosophers, who often use the naive argument that if there were an unconscious psyche there would be two subjects in the individual instead of one. But that is precisely the case, in spite of the supposed unity of the personality. It is, indeed, the great trouble of our time that so many people exist whose right hand not know what their left is doing. It is by no means the neurotic alone who finds himself in this predicament. It is not a recent development, nor can it blamed on Christian morality. It is, on the contrary, the symptom of a general unconsciousness that is the heritage of all mankind. The development of consciousness is a slow and laborious process that untold ages to reach the civilized state, which we date somewhat arbitrarily from the invention of writing, atxutnc. Although the development since that date seems to be considerable, it is still far from complete. Indefinitely large areas of the mind still remain in darkness. What we call psyche is by no means identical with consciousness and its contents. Those who deny the existence of the unconscious do not realize that they are actually assuming our knowledge of the psyche to complete, with nothing left for further discoveries. It is exactly as if they declared our present knowledge of nature to be the summit of all possible knowledge. Our psyche is part of nature, and its enigma is just as limitless. We cannot define nature or psyche, but can only state what, at present, we understand them to know. Man and his senses, therefore, could make such a statement as, there is no unconscious, i.e., no psychic contents of which he and others are unconscious, not to mention the mountain of convincing evidence that medical science has accumulated. It is not, of course, scientific responsibility or honesty that causes such resistance, but age-old messianism, fear of the new and unknown. This peculiar resistance to the unknown part of the psyche has its historical reasons. Consciousness is a very acquisition and as such is still in men. By specific dangers, and easily injured. As a matter of fact, one of the most common mental derangements among primitives consists in the loss of a soul, which, as the term indicates, means a noticeable disunion of consciousness. On the primitive level the psyche or soul is by no means a unit, as is widely said. Many primitives assume that, as well as his own, a man has a bush soul, incarnate in a wild animal or a tree, with which he is connected by a kind of psychic identity. This is what Levi-Bruhl called participation mystique. Point 2. In the case of an animal it is a sort of brother, so much so that a man whose brother is a crocodile is supposed to be safe while swimming across a river. In the case of a tree, the tree is to have authority over the individual like a parent. Injury to the bush soul means an equal injury to the man. Others assume that a man has a of souls, which shows clearly that the primitive often feels that he consists of several units. This indicates that his psyche is far from being safely synthesized. On the contrary, it threatens to fall asunder only easily under the onslaught of unchanged emotions. What we observe in the seemingly remote sphere of the primitive mind has by no means vanished in our advanced civilization. Only often. As I have said, the right hand does not know what the left is doing, and in a state of violent affect one frequently forgets who one is, so that people can ask, what the devil has got into you? We are accessed and altered by our MCXDS, we can suddenly unreasonable, or exordant facts unaccountably vanish from our memory. We talk about being able to control ourselves, but self-control is a rare and remarkable